Welcome to OK Let's Talk. My name is Rob, and today we're diving into the latest global reports from all around the world. And we're not just watching the news, we're breaking down the history and the why behind the headlines to give you a deeper educational perspective. And with that said, let's get to the analysis. Educational commentary and analysis falls under Fair Use, Section 107.
It's 2000 GMT. This is Al Jazeera live from Doha with our continuing coverage of the war between the US, Israel and Iran. I'm Sami Zaidan. These are the latest developments.
President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell.
The US tells Iran to accept defeat or face attacks harder than ever before.
Of the war between the US,
Iran's
Israel
Foreign Minister
and
says
Iran.
there's no intention to negotiate with the US. Abbas Araghchi insists Tehran is looking for a permanent end to the conflict. The US and Israel have carried out more strikes on Iran. At least 12 people are killed in southern Tehran. Prime Minister
Of course,
Benjamin
there's more
Netanyahu says
strikes. I
Israel
mean,
is
why wouldn't there be
expanding
more
what he
strikes?
calls a
Trump said the
buffer
war's
zone
over,
in southern
right?
Lebanon. The US is urging Iran to accept defeat, saying American forces have already crippled much of Tehran's military capability. Now, the White House says President Donald Trump is prepared to, quote, unleash hell if Iran fails to comply. The
Sure.
escalating rhetoric is dimming hopes of any imminent de-escalation, as violence on the ground shows no sign of easing after nearly 4 weeks.
If Iran fails to accept the reality of the current moment, if they fail to understand that they have been defeated militarily and will continue to be, President Trump will ensure they are hit harder than they have ever been hit before.
Speaking fast and
President
anger
Trump does
with
not
anger
bluff, and he is prepared
isn't
to unleash hell.
doing anything.
Iran should not
This
miscalculate
Trump is all.
again.
This
Their
administration's all
massive
bluster,
miscalculation cost
no
them
balls.
Their senior leadership, their Navy, their Air Force, and their air defense system. Any violence beyond this point will be because the Iranian regime refused to understand they have already been defeated and refused to come
Have they?
to a deal.
They've been defeated. Doesn't look like they've been
Iran's
defeated.
Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi says no talks have been held with the United States. He says exchange of messages through mediators do not amount to negotiations with Washington. But earlier, Iranian diplomatic sources told Al Jazeera Tehran has received a 15-point US peace proposal, describing it as unreasonable. The US-Israeli attacks have continued on Iran. Meanwhile, at least 12 people have been killed in Tehran. Iran has retaliated by striking central and northern Israel. And Israel has continued to target Beirut. Strikes have also hit several towns and cities in southern Lebanon. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's expanding what he calls a buffer zone in Lebanon.
Of course, it's always buffer zones,
Live
right?
this hour in Riyadh,
Occupied
Ramallah
territory.
in the occupied West Bank, Washington, D.C., Beirut,
Never ends for Bibi.
and in Tehran, where we start with Ali Hashim. He's live for us from the Iranian capital. And Ali, the Iranian foreign minister says Iran has no intention of holding talks. How about responding formally through Pakistan to that U.S. proposal?
Well, it's clear that despite the rhetoric, there is also an attempt by the Iranian diplomacy to express readiness for dialogue. I mean, yes, it might be that the Iranians have reservations on the 15 points that the Americans offered, but at the same time, the Iranians are offering their own points on the table, so there is already a table, regardless whether there is direct, indirect, or just messages being conveyed through friendly countries, just as Araghchi said. Another issue is that despite what the sources were telling us during the day, I heard Araghchi speaking in this interview, and I had the impression that he said that still the paper is being studied by the higher authorities. So this contradicts what the state TV was saying and what other sources in the country were telling journalists, including us. So we are here in front of conflicting, let me say, because I need to choose the words here, conflicting feelings, maybe, conflicting signals. So the sources are giving certain signals. The foreign minister in an interview with the national television, with the state television, is giving also another signal. Yes, he used a very strong rhetoric, very harsh rhetoric when it came to the United States. Yet, when he mentioned that this war is not a war of the United States, it's the war of Israel, this gives an indication that he is still preserving one of the bridges. So the idea of holding negotiations is still on the table.
Stay with
Well, certainly a
Let's
war
bring
being
in
pushed
John
by Bibi
Hendren. He's
and the
joining us
Saudis.
from Washington, D.C. Now, John, are the U.S.
Trump's stupid enough to fall
threats
for it.
hit Iran even harder, you know, as bleak as that picture looks? Is it also being seen as a sign of just how keen, if not desperate, Donald Trump is and the White House is to try and end this war quickly on its terms?
Yes, I mean, I think it's fair to say that Trump is very much trying to bring this to an end. You know, he's got a lot of pressure here.
By bringing in the 82nd Airborne?
Prices have gone up, not
That's a hell of a way to bring it to an end.
gas, but of all products that are transported or use any of those sources of energy. And he has been offering positive statements day after day, and it's successfully boosted stocks and pushed oil down after a significant series of rises in oil prices. But Trump has been talking a lot of sort of more happy talk, whereas from Carolyn Levitt, what you heard was the other side of that. You know, if you look at the seal of the United States, it's an eagle, and he's got an olive branch in
Trump's
one
a demented loon.
talon and arrows in the other.
Jesus.
And Trump seems to be wielding both of those. It seems like the military threat is a way to try, is the stick, and the carrot is some kind of an agreement that would stop this conflict. And as it continues in the Gulf area and in Israel, the U.S. has paused the attacks on the Iranian energy program. There are talks of a meeting in Islamabad as soon as Thursday. But yeah, I think it's fair to say that what Trump is trying to do is trying to use negotiations to bring this to an end, and using military power as a threat in case the Iranians don't do that.
A threat to Ali in Tehran, which the Speaker of the Iranian Parliament is saying is taking shape in the form of what they expect to be an attack on an island, an attempt to take an Iranian island with regional help. What is he referring to?
What's up, Richard?
Well, given what's been circulating about Khark Island, the island where most of the Iranian oil gets exported from, it could be one of the possibilities. There are other islands also, the Greater Tomb, Smaller Tomb, and Abu Musa are other ones. And here, in case these are the ones, then he might be hinting towards the UAE. But we don't have a clear picture. I mean, it's just about speculation. However, it's just as Arakchi was signaling diplomacy with a crust of harsh rhetoric. It's clear here that Mr. Ghalibaf, who is said to be the person that might meet with J.D. Vance, the American vice president in Islamabad, just in case this meeting is going to happen, is projecting power at the same time with a crust of warning to the United States, and to the regional country he is mentioning, that there's no need for such an adventure, because such an adventure is going to be faced with Iranian resistance.
All right, let's thank Ali in Tehran. Back to John in Washington, D.C. And John, any sign from the U.S. if that is what they're sending troops to do, to try and take an island, as Ali was outlining?
The hell of a way to end the war.
That President Trump is keeping his options open. There is the threat of military force, which the U.S. presumably hopes will in itself be enough of a motivator for Iran. But there's also the capability that comes with that. The 7,000 troops that are on their way are 2 Marine Expeditionary Units and the 82nd Airborne. That's significant because the 82nd Airborne are paratroopers who specialize in dropping down on land and then seizing it. Those Marine Expeditionary Units are units that work on land. They're foot soldiers that work with air and sea assets. So together, they carry the capability to take over land, key land like Karg Island, which is the
take it over and then hold it indefinitely. So another forever war. That is what we're looking at. Months, years.
Oil exports of Iran. But the problem there is not seizing the island. They've got the capability to do that. The problem would be holding it under constant fire from Iran. And that's the kind of thing the U.S. is hoping not to do. Donald Trump has always tried to avoid, always been critical of big extended military conflicts like Iraq and Afghanistan. And all signs suggest he doesn't want to get into a protracted conflict, but he's leaving
well, he shouldn't have started
that
one
option open. And Pentagon officials say that is what the military is there for. If they don't act, they have still been effective in many cases if their presence causes the enemy to act.
And that's John Hendren for us from Washington, D.C. Iran continued to strike targets inside Israel on Wednesday. An Iranian missile landed near the city of Haifa.
That would be a huge mistake, man.
Into the sky.
Iran's already said they'll hit all the infrastructure in the area.
The town of
Trump's not going to do that. That's a war crime. It's a war crime.
West Bank. So, Noor, before we talk about those strikes, first of all, are we hearing anything from Israeli officials on this exchange of messages through third parties and through the media about ending the war?
Well, we're seeing a lot of leaks, Sami, about where Israel stands, about concerns that Trump might just abruptly end the war. But we saw also part of a very tough conversation that Netanyahu had with mayors and heads of local councils of northern communities, where he tried to project strength and victory and talk about achievements in Iran, but really those mayors were telling him that people were fleeing northern communities, that they felt vulnerable and abandoned, and he spoke about expanding the occupied territory, the territory that Israel is occupying in Lebanon. Take a listen.
We have created a genuine security zone that does not allow a ground infiltration towards the Galilee or the northern border. We are expanding the security zone to push the threat.
Well, this nut is expanding the war, and Trump supposedly wants to end it.
On our territory. We are simply creating a large buffer zone.
Let's go to Tony Cheng. He's live for us from Beirut. So how is Hezbollah responding?
Yeah, I agree. The war's going terrible, man.
Threat from Israel?
I mean, all Iran has to do is not lose. They don't have to win, just not lose.
General Naim Qassem,
and they can do that.
Today, in which
and just keep threatening the Strait, keep threatening their neighbors.
Invasion by Israel. He talked about the danger, a war that Lebanon and Hezbollah are now in a war against the United States and Israel. He said Hezbollah would be doing everything to defend Lebanese soil. He talked about the young fighters who are down fighting in the south. We've seen that backed up. Hezbollah said they fired volleys of rockets into the western Galilee region of Israel this afternoon. And we've also heard of numerous Israeli strikes coming into southern Lebanon. But I think it's a real concern here that the Israeli military has issued commands for people not just to move back north of the Litani River, but today out north of the Zahrani River. And that suggests that not only are they going to push up, they're going to create this large buffer zone. And that's a real concern here. There are now more than 1 million people displaced in Lebanon. I think many of them clearly hoping that they will be able to return to their homes. If we see continued fighting in these areas, they may be displaced for much longer. And that's putting enormous strain on Lebanese society too. I think while Hezbollah is a contentious subject here,
Yep,
there is
I agree.
also a grudging respect that at this stage, with all of this offensive action from the Israelis as they cross the borders, they try to move up into the south of the country, Hezbollah are actually the ones who are putting themselves on the line to stand in their way.
Let's go back to Noor Ouda, talking about things on the line. We've seen the Iranian missile attacks on a number of significant places, right? So Haifa, Eilat. Take us through what that pattern tells us.
Well, it tells us that these major cities, these major locations have been under sustained Iranian fire. And we've seen extensive damage cleared by the Israeli military censor, Sami. But let's take a look at what these cities mean. Tel Aviv is the financial nerve or financial center of Israel. This is where you have the stock exchange, but it's also where you have the Ministry of Defense, the headquarters of the Mossad, the spy agency, and many other important assets. The airport, of course, and several air bases. Haifa, the port. This is where the
I don't know
Navy
if it's treason,
is, where the
but Trump
petrochemicals
removing
are, where
sanctions
the oil
on Iranian
reserves
oil
are,
while
where
he's
the
at war
power
with
station
Iran is
Deira,
completely idiotic.
also nearby,
Makes
which was struck
no sense.
Today, there is
Totally
a
stupid.
power plant that
But that's
gives
Trump.
or provides about a fifth of the country's electricity. Safad, where you have intelligence capabilities, that strike was completely blacked out by the censor. Dimona, of course, where the nuclear program is, the program itself was not struck, but the city itself sustained damage. Arad nearby as well. And Eilat, of course, not just a tourist destination, but
somebody
a
was
place
doing
that
insider
is
trading,
used
that's for
by the
sure.
Israeli
Probably
Navy.
his
So
kids.
all of those places have been hit. In the Negev, there was also
I
an
read
industrial
that
zone that was
Trump
targeted.
Trump's
All of it
intelligence
sustaining
briefings
damage.
are nothing
All
more
of them,
than
all of that
videos
picture put
of us
together,
blowing
Sami,
stuff up,
means that Israel cannot
because that's
lift
all his
restrictions, cannot
dementia-addled
resume
brain can
normal
handle.
life for ordinary Israelis.
So instead of real
Millions of
intel
them
briefings
have
about
had
how the
to
war is
go
actually
to the
going,
shelters
they're just showing
repeatedly.
him
That
positive
puts a lot
videos of us
economic,
doing
but
damage.
also psychological pressure on the population, and that will turn into political pressure on the Israeli government.
I believe
which
it.
is expected to extend the state of emergency.
Barron should volunteer
tomorrow,
to go over
Thursday.
there and fight.
And let's thank Noor Ouda in Ramallah, Tony Chang in Beirut. Let's take a closer look at the latest U.S. troop deployments. The amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli is leaving Taiwan. It's scheduled to arrive in the Middle East later this week. The U.S. vessel
Good,
is carrying
let's
the
leave Taiwan
31st
vulnerable to
Marine
the Chinese
Expeditionary Unit with its
for Trump's war of
complement
choice. It's a brilliant
F-35
move.
stealth
What could go
jets and
wrong?
about 2,300 Marines. Another assault ship, the USS Boxer, left Southern California last week along with accompanying warships. It's expected to arrive in the region by mid-April with around 2,200 Marines from the 11th Expeditionary Unit and 2,000 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division are expected to deploy in the Middle East in the coming days. Joining us from Washington, D.C. is Jason Campbell. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute and former civilian.
Well, I mean, there isn't really
Pentagon
much the
official. Good to
Democrats
have
could
you
do.
with
They
us.
have
So,
zero
first of all,
power.
we've heard
Zero.
the White House
Till
talk
November anyway.
about hitting Iran
I mean, not that they're
harder than
great.
ever before, unleashing hell. What is the White House threatening from a military analysis perspective, do you think?
Well, thank you for having me. It's very difficult to say authoritatively because we've been hearing this rhetoric now on a near daily basis from President Trump, from other senior officials, and we know that the U.S. is carrying out airstrikes along with Israel on a host of military targets throughout the country. What one day of unleashing hell ties to another, or what's being done differently, however, has yet to be articulated, and it seems to be at least partially part of the rhetoric coming out of this administration.
Let's take one scenario. Could it be intensified airstrikes on targets like the power plants, which Donald Trump had threatened to do, something that Western leaders have for a while condemned Russia for targeting energy infrastructure in Ukraine, framing it as outrageous, barbaric, and so on. Is that really what Donald Trump would, do you see him really going through with that?
Well, I think part of his intent here is to be less than specific on some of the details. I think at the very least, he wants the Iranian regime to think that he's capable of doing that and that he will do it. We've certainly heard, not just rumors, but the president himself threatened to, expand these targets outside of what would be considered strictly military and into some of these other civilian domains, like you said, power plants and oil refineries and the like. What we haven't seen yet is their willingness to do it.
They definitely get
be a
contributions from APAC for sure.
Escalation in the war.
Has the U.S. figured out a way to protect Gulf allies were it to do something like that in the last, what is it now, 48, 72 hours since that threat was made? Or is it just not looking at that and not too worried about the cost that the Gulf might pay in terms of Iranian retaliation?
Well, I think that the U.S. and its Gulf partners have their respective abilities to confront Iranian threats. They've had to expend a lot of those assets.
Yeah, but he was in the Senate for a long time.
I don't know that the U.S. has
but
anything.
Jason, we've still seen Iranian
novel.
Missiles make it through, right, and hit oil installations, even if the interception rate is high.
Absolutely, and that is some of the most vulnerable infrastructure in the Gulf are some of these connected to energy and electricity, water desalination. These are things that I think are absolutely a factor that weigh in the mind of President Trump and certainly the Pentagon as it considers its next steps. And I think should do so with the, if not understanding, then certainly the assumption that Iran would hit these types of targets in kind.
Could we know a lot of U.S. troops, or some U.S. troops, a lot is a relative term, I guess. So I think the numbers come to something like 8,000 are on the way on various ships. I went through them a moment ago. Could they be used in your understanding of military planning? Could they be used?
Biden wasn't perfect.
To seize an island, for example, something
he was better than this lunatic.
Seems convinced from his statements tonight that is something the U.S. is going to do.
Well, certainly, as you said, 8,000 is a number that is relative. It's certainly not what you would call anywhere near an invasion force in terms of the Iranian mainland. There is a lot of speculation about some of the islands, be it Karg, farther up the Persian Gulf, or some of the smaller islands closer to the Strait of Hormuz. Even if it was going to some sort of attack or invasion was going to focus more on some of these smaller targets, I have a lot of concern about what the amount of risk these would be taking on, the forces there. We've got these forces are all sort of crisis management type forces that are available to be called on in cases of an emergency. I think my concern now is that the Pentagon is just sort of reaching out to these units because they're available to go and don't necessarily conform to a pre-planned operation. I think that if you put
no
even
plan.
6,000 to
That's
8,000
typical.
forces on one of these islands, they would be at great risk to absorb a lot of firepower from Iran. I don't know how long they could hold an island under that level of risk. And quite frankly, I don't know whether or not that would move the strategic needle in the favor of the U.S. and Israel in terms of opening the Strait of Hormuz in the first place.
So you mentioned the exposure to missile and drone attacks. How are we seeing the Pentagon take other necessary steps, usually for the deployment of ground troops? Things like logistics, supplies for food. How would you resupply them with water? How would you resupply them with ammunition? How would you redeploy them, assumedly, at some point, or rotate them?
That's an excellent question. And again, this is where that
Trump doesn't have
8,000
any
number,
answers for it.
Really, in the grand scheme of things, isn't all that many. And these Marine Expeditionary Units are what we call organically supported as a unit. They have an air element, a ground element, obviously a naval element, and they have a sustainment element. The problem is they're best suited for an operation that might last a couple of weeks. And if this, as speculated, if they're going to be used to hold an island for a longer duration and under what would be, I would expect to be pretty persistent fires, all of those logistical questions are going to come into the frame very quickly. And what forces might be available to either backfill or serve as some sort of an emergency element probably wouldn't be ready, because these are the contingency units that they're relying on for such an attack.
Don't worry, Whiskey Pete is all over it.
But
He'll take care of it.
and helping us get through some of them. Jason Campbell there, Senior Fellow at the Middle East Institute. And Kuwait, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar and Jordan, they've all issued a joint statement calling on Iraq to take all necessary measures to prevent attacks launched from its territory against neighboring countries. Well, let's bring in Rasul Sardar in the Saudi capital, Riyadh. And Rasul, over the course of this war, of course, we've been seeing tensions rise between Arab countries and Iran. Are we now seeing tensions rise between some of those Arab countries and Iraq?
Indeed, Sami, and that is over the Iranian proxies in the region. In the past, we have seen that these proxies or Iran-aligned groups targeting these regional countries, including very critical infrastructure such as Aramco in Saudi Arabia. But now, practically, there is a war going on in the region, and now it is going beyond the borders of Iran. So 5 GCC member states and plus Jordan, they have just released a joint statement asking Baghdad to stop the military groups, the armed groups aligned with Iran, to stop their attacks on the regional countries. In the last couple of days, we have seen that there have been some drones indeed fired from the territory of Iraq toward the regional countries. And the statement is simply saying that if Iraq wants to preserve the good relations with the regional countries, it has to stop them. And also in the same statement, there is a clear reference again to 51, the article of the UN Charter. That is an article about the right of self-defense when a country comes under attack, having the right to retaliate. And now this statement is once again referring to that article, saying that regional countries preserve that right to retaliate. So far, nothing has been materialized, but we are more and more frequently hearing these references. And also in the same statement, that is quite interesting, Sami, they're saying not only Iran-aligned groups here, but also the statement is talking about the sleeper cells and also the organizations affiliated with Hezbollah that are planning the plots, particularly in Kuwait. And just while we're preparing for this live report, there has been a statement coming from the Kuwaiti Minister of Interior announcing the dismantling of a Hezbollah-linked terror cell and the foiling of a plot to assassinate the state leaders and senior officials and harm the state's higher interest. And the statement goes on saying that the Minister of Interior announces that following the precise surveillance and monitoring operations, it has successfully thwarted a terrorist plot and dismantled a network consisting of 5 citizens and 1 Kuwaiti individual whose citizenship has been revoked recently, while identifying and locating 14 fugitive defendants outside the country, 5 citizens, 9 non-Kuwaiti individuals whose citizenship have been revoked recently, and 2 individuals of Iranian nationality and 2 individuals of Lebanese nationality. So we are seeing that now it is going beyond the borders, going beyond the armed groups that are affiliated to Iran. But clearly now there is a new dimension, talking about the sleeper cells and the plots, the groups that are inserted in these countries, and now
Trump
this
puts
is
boots on the
really
ground,
becoming an internal
everything in the whole
security
region's
issue
going to blow up,
for the
man.
country as a
It's just going to
part
get
of the
completely out of
asymmetric
control
war that is
immediately.
now tremendously affecting the region.
Rasul Sardar from Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, meanwhile, has been speaking. He's been calling for an end to this war.
My message to the United States and Israel is that it is high time to end the war as human suffering deepens, civilian casualties mount, and the global economic impact is increasingly devastating. And my message to Iran is to stop attacking their neighbors that are not parties to the conflict. The Security Council has condemned these attacks and demanded that they end.
Ah, crap, I gotta talk over this music. I'm gonna get a copyright complaint.
You're watching Al Jazeera. Let's recap our headlines now. The White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt is warning Iran President Donald Trump is prepared to, quote, unleash hell if Tehran does not accept his terms for a ceasefire. Leavitt also
He's gonna unleash hell, everyone.
through diplomatic
Like he hasn't done it already. Thought the war was over. It's over. We've won. Yada yada. Blah blah blah.
15-point US peace
15-point plan.
And has called it unreasonable. Tehran demanded guarantees the war will not resume.
Yeah, of course,
after an
Jay.
agreement
It's
and
just going to make everything worse. You want to try to
US and
de-escalate
Israel
at this
are
point,
keeping
not
up
make it
attacks on
worse.
Iran. At least 12 people have been killed in the south of Tehran.
Well, Iraq's being asked to help make sure that
US
insurgents in their
airstrike
country don't
targeting
attack
Iraq's
anywhere
popular
else. I
mobilization
don't know.
forces has killed at least 7 people. 20 others were wounded in the attack in Al-Anbar province in the west. The Defense Ministry says a base used by the armed group and military personnel was hit. 15 fighters were killed when the same area was hit again on Tuesday. Nicholas Huck joins us live from the Iraqi capital, Baghdad. So, Nicholas, the last time we spoke about an hour ago, you said you heard warplanes over you. What became of that operation?
They're still there, Sammy. They're still hovering above. Now, people in Baghdad haven't heard the sound of airplanes like this since the height of the American invasion of Iraq. And when I was out and about and I spoke to some of the Iraqis, they see this both with stoic cynicism, and some of the people talk about an act of provocation. They feel that they are dragged in a war that is not their own. Of course, there are Iranian-backed militias here in Iraq that are active, that are targeting U.S. bases, the U.S. Victory Base last week, the U.S. Embassy here in Baghdad last week, at the heart of the capital, and then the U.S. consulate in Erbil, where U.S. air defense systems, CRAM, were activated. I can hear the planes right now hovering above. And so it's clear that there is an escalation here with the Iranian-backed militias who say they will continue to target American presence on the ground, and the Americans continuing to target these Iranian-backed militias in Iraq at the same time. We've heard from a statement from one of them, Awliya El-Dem, the brigades of the Guardian, saying that they are targeting the American presence exclusively in the Gulf states and Jordan. So there are militia groups inside Iraq targeting bases throughout the region. And they say that they are compelled to intensify their operation against the military presence as more American troops on the ground are being deployed. Sammy?
All right, Nicholas Huck there from
I agree,
Baghdad.
John. Literally the dumbest president ever.
Financial markets remain
Don't ask him. He'll tell you he's the smartest of all time. He knows more about war than anybody else in the history of war.
On Wednesday, after President Donald Trump suggested diplomatic efforts with Iran were making progress. They've since pared back some of those gains, though. The global oil benchmark price
He says one thing, stocks do one thing. He says something else, stocks do another. Oil goes up, oil goes down. It's all a manipulation.
More from New York.
We're all being gaslit.
The Dow Jones Industrial Average trending downward, a 4-week losing streak for the Dow. And rising oil prices, of course, have gotten a lot of the attention for traders. It's a lot of the focus of concern. But there's another trend that
Netanyahu is a warmonger,
just as worried about,
Anita.
and that is rising bond yields.
And we can't win.
Which correlates to rising
All Iran has to do is
rates.
not lose.
And yesterday there was a bond sale, and we saw evidence
Thanks,
that
Darla.
investors are
Like and subscribe.
less willing to invest in
TDS,
treasuries in this high
from the same people that never shut up about Joe
causes
Biden.
bond yields to rise. And of course, bringing down
Is this what you voted for, Darla? Higher prices and forever wars in the Middle East? I think Trump campaigned on the opposite.
Higher costs for businesses, higher costs for Americans who are trying to buy a home. And we know Americans are very concerned about rising prices, and that's going to be a central issue in the midterm elections, which are coming. So
Yes,
all
he
of that
is.
No doubt
And he
factoring
surrounded
into
himself with liars
pressure
too,
that's
Brian.
being put on the White House to come to a deal.
Trump's diaper
The Trump
soggy.
administration says
That's
oil
funny.
from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been released to alleviate rising prices linked to the war with Iran. The U.S. intends to release the
I think it's possible that the fire was started not because they don't want to die for someone else's war, but I mean, what's the typical deployment for an aircraft carrier? It's what, 6 months, and they were already overdue to come home, and Trump sent them over there. These kids just want to get home, man. They got families. They got other things, you know. So it wouldn't surprise me if it was started on purpose, just to get the hell home.
172 million barrels, the second biggest release in its history.
There's a lot of oil out there. That'll get healed very quickly.
The U.S. Strategic Reserve holds more oil than any other country in the world, up to 714 million barrels. Right now, it's sitting about 415 million barrels, according to the Energy Department. The U.S. burns through roughly 20 million barrels a day, about the same amount that usually flows through the Strait of Hormuz. There are 4 main sites, 2 in Texas, 2 in Louisiana, and they're all near the country's largest refineries and major pipelines.
You're right, Brian.
That allows oil to flow quickly when it's needed. Being close to the Gulf also makes shipping, importing, and distributing oil along the coast much easier. The reserve is tucked deep underground, stored in massive salt caverns.
I wish,
For
Jay.
keeping oil safe over the long haul. The reserve was set up after the 1970s Arab embargo to protect the country from supply shocks. Presidents have leaned on the SPR during global crises.
This is a wartime bridge to increase oil supply until production ramps up later this year.
Joe Biden tapped it in 2022, releasing 180 million barrels after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the biggest drawdown in the reserve's history.
And it didn't do shit for
Barack
prices.
Obama took out 30 million
None of
barrels
this
in
does.
2011
None of this helps
to
long
offset
term
supply
with prices at the
disruptions
pump.
from the civil war in Libya. George
Doesn't work.
H.W. Bush
It's a waste.
authorized 34 million barrels during the first Gulf War. This current release leaves the SPR at around 60% of capacity, but still one of the largest emergency stockpiles in the world, and something the president has promised to address.
We will start at the appropriate time, which is basically a gut instinct. We will start filling up the strategic reserves.
He's got to feel it in his bones.
Becoming more common because the cost of fuel
Gut
has
instinct.
risen
Just
since
start
the start of
refilling
the
it.
war in Iran. People are feeling the pain at the pumps. But that's what the strategic reserve is for. It's a crucial backup when global markets are shaky.
Doesn't matter if you release the oil, you still can't refine enough of it quick enough.
Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Now, the war
Releasing the
between
oil is only
US,
one part of the
Israel and
equation.
Iran has triggered an energy and economic crisis across the world.
Now we've got a
Asia is
refinery in
perhaps
Port
the
Arthur,
hardest
Texas, shut down.
Nearly every country highly dependent on oil and gas from the Middle East. The panic has led governments scrambling for solutions. Kulsum Sharif explains.
The war in the Middle
Thanks,
East
Jay.
has sent shockwaves right across
Stable
Asia,
genius.
from India to Indonesia. Now, the conflict poses a major challenge for the continent as the world's biggest consumer of Middle East crude oil. And
Yeah, it's funny
all
how the
because of
Epstein
what's
files are
happening here in the
not even
world's
being
most
talked about
important
anymore, right?
energy corridor, the Strait of Hormuz.
Yep,
Roughly about
Afghanistan
20%
vibes.
of
I
global
agree.
Oil and gas supplies produced in the region pass through this strait. Now, Iran has effectively shut it since the start of the war, blocking shipments, most of which are meant for Asia. Also, the attacks on energy sites across the region hasn't helped because it's resulted in a halt in production. Now, India, Pakistan and Bangladesh rely heavily on the Gulf for their energy needs. Now, India has invoked emergency measures and it's also relying on unsanctioned Russian supplies after President Trump allowed it. Now, the oil and gas reserves in Pakistan and Bangladesh are low, and this is the impact. People scrambling to get fuel, and several
Could be, Jay.
shops already shut. Now, China is faring better because it's already stockpiled crude before the war began. It's one of the biggest buyers of Iranian oil despite Western sanctions. And Iran has reportedly allowed Chinese vessels to pass through the Strait of Hormuz on the other side to bring in supplies.
Yep.
And Beijing also has another reliable partner, and that's Russia, for its supplies.
Trump shoes on the ground. Yeah. Are they oversized?
Now we have Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan that have introduced energy voucher programs to protect consumers from rising prices. And for the first time in decades, Seoul has introduced a fuel cap.
It's what MAGA and QAnon wanted, right? They wanted these people all rounded up. They wanted the files released. And then they elected their boy, and he's like, no, we're not doing it. And they're like, okay, we love pedophiles now, I guess. And war, and higher prices.
Fuel subsidies. Finally, we have Vietnam and the Philippines that are struggling. Vietnam doesn't have much of oil reserves.
Bibi wouldn't like that, Jay.
And we have the Philippine president who's declared an energy emergency that allows authorities to prioritize fuel distribution.
Now in India, frustration is growing about potential fuel shortages. Drivers in some states have been queuing at fuel stations for hours. India imports about 90% of its crude oil, mostly from Gulf states. It has negotiated with Iran to allow its tankers through the Strait of Hormuz after they were stuck for days. India has also increased purchases from Russia after the US eased sanctions. The government insists India has enough petrol. Workers' rights advocates in the Philippines are demanding higher wages to help deal with soaring fuel costs. They marched to the presidential palace in Manila to make their case. The president had declared a national energy emergency to deal with energy shortages. Barnaby Lowe reports from Manila.
Following Philippine President
all this crap is being created because of Trump. All these people suffering all around the world because of Trump. Trump and Bibi and Putin.
Calling for higher wages, double the national minimum wage, as oil prices have more than doubled since the United States and Israel first launched attacks against Iran. These activists have been calling for higher wages even before the current economic crisis brought about by the conflict in the Middle East, but now they say it's more urgent than ever because surely prices of basic goods and services will also go up.
We won't accept the argument that wages can be raised because we are in a crisis. That would mean we bear the burden when it's not our fault. It's the fault of the US for starting a war.
These protesters also say measures under the executive order
Electric's the way to go, man.
national emergency don't go beyond what they describe as
I just got my kid an e-bike so he can get back and forth to work.
already been implementing, for instance, cash handouts and fuel subsidies, the crackdown on fuel hoarding and profiteering, and energy-saving measures. They say that the executive order does not explicitly give the government power to, for example, put price caps on basic commodities and control over fuel pricing. They want excise taxes and value measures were issued. The office of the president had contended that there was no crisis yet. Clearly, these protesters say the government was downplaying the situation and lying. And now there is no question that the country is in crisis. Barnaby Lowe, Al Jazeera, Manila.
African countries are among the most exposed to supply disruptions and higher prices caused by the Middle East war. Fuel in Zimbabwe is now more than $2 per litre, driving up the cost of goods. Hara Mutasa is in Harare, where people say they're struggling to cope with price hikes.
In Zimbabwe, these vehicles are called combis, public transport, which a lot of people here use. Last week, the price of fuel went up. Petrol is now selling at $2.17 per litre. Diesel is at $2.05 a litre. Now, when fuel goes up, transport costs also go up. And people here are frustrated.
It is affecting us for transport. We go to work every day, so it's too much.
Yeah.
We can't afford it.
Who's going to clean the shit up off the roads, man?
Because we are not getting any increase at work, and then the pay is up, and it's a bit difficult for us.
This is where we could soon start seeing problems. Public hospitals. Nurses across the country are saying it's now too expensive for them to go to work. And they've told the government if salaries aren't increased, they're going to go on strike. Countries such as Nigeria and Angola, big oil producers in Africa, could be cushioned a little bit, but most countries on the continent import fuel. This is Mbare Musika, one of the biggest markets in the capital. Now, when fuel prices go up, food prices also increase, and there are fears there could be shortages across the continent. Haru Mutasa, Al Jazeera, Harare.
The war on Iran has intensified criticism towards the laws for asylum seekers and migrants in Sweden. You see, teenagers are being deported to the Middle East, Africa and beyond, despite growing up with their families in Scandinavia. The Swedish government has come under pressure with the general elections taking place later this year. Paul Rees reports from Stockholm.
Ilya Tahareki arrives early to open up his mother's hairdressing business in Stockholm. He's been in Sweden since the age of 8, when his family fled Iran. He's grown up speaking Swedish as well as feeling Swedish. After years of temporary residency, he then got a message from the Swedish authorities when he turned 18. Utvisning, deportation. Being an adult meant he was no longer considered a dependent of his Swedish resident mother and would be sent back to Iran.
I don't speak the language. I haven't been raised like them, so I don't even know how to talk. A lot of teenagers have already been deported to other countries. I don't think anyone morally would say this is a good situation or, oh, we meant to do it this way.
The Aftonbladet newspaper in Stockholm is investigating the fate of dozens of young people being deported to Syria, Somalia, Iran and elsewhere.
Artist who works in a hospital.
They can be deported if their permanent residence hasn't been approved by the time they turn 18, even if one of their parents is a Swedish resident.
Swedish migration policies has been tightened for many years now, and there has not been any rage about that. But now suddenly the story is about their friends, people who are one of us, and then reactions and feelings have been very strong about this.
This has led to a pause in deportations while authorities try to change direction. The government has responded by saying it will try to create what it's calling a legal safety valve to stop the deportation of teenagers in cases where the consequences would be unreasonable. But teenagers whose deportation was already decided are still being detained pending their removal. The exact number to have already left is still not clear.
We have found out over 90 cases of teen deportations from last year, but it's probably much more. Over 2,000 people that were between the age 18 and 21 got the refusal from staying in Sweden.
Some families had to endure their children being sent back to Iran just before the war started. While the conflict has gone on, Ilya has been in limbo.
They haven't been able to handle the migration policy correctly. And currently you have a situation where they're overcorrecting it and making it so strict to the point where all the good things that come out of migration are just being taken away.
Sweden may now have to reflect on the freedom and shelter being taken away from those it once vowed to help. Paul Rees, Al Jazeera, Stockholm.
Time for some of the day's other top stories now. A Los Angeles jury has found Google and Meta liable for $3 million in damages in a landmark lawsuit. The case involves a 20-year-old woman who said the design of Google's YouTube and Meta's Instagram led her to becoming addicted at a young age. The jury found both tech companies negligent in failing to warn about the dangers of the apps. The verdict could pave the way for thousands more cases against major tech companies.
Give me a break.
There are so many families who've been tragically hurt.
Tragically hurt?
Addiction of social media.
Addiction of social media. Come on, find your balls.
Of what these social media platforms
Christ.
can do. That's protected under the judge's rulings.
I'm addicted to Fireball. I don't blame Sazerac.
And we've sent a message with this that you will be held accountable for the features.
How about you hold the people accountable, the parents accountable, the kids accountable?
Regardless of whether they're being sexploitated, regardless of those types of issues, just because of the features alone.
This guy's straight out of Central Casting. Jesus Christ.
Can be held accountable. That's a huge message for these companies.
At least 9 soldiers have been killed in Nigeria in an ambush by armed groups. One police officer and a resident were also killed in the attack in northwestern state of Kebbi. No group has claimed responsibility. Some locals believe Islamic State Sahel province was behind it. It's the latest in a series of violent attacks where armed groups frequently target security forces and remote communities in areas with a limited security presence. In Gaza, water has become more than a daily necessity. It's a daily struggle.
Another humanitarian crisis created by Bibi.
Destruction. Large parts of the water network remain damaged or completely out of service. Families now wait for hours just to fill a few containers, while doctors warn contaminated water is causing a growing health crisis. Our correspondent Hani Mahmoud reports from Gaza City.
Under the winter sun, Palestinians in Gaza gather around water trucks, holding empty containers, waiting. For many neighborhoods, they are now the only reliable source of water. Israel's war destroyed large sections of Gaza water infrastructure. Pipelines were hit, pumping stations stopped working, and heavy machinery needed for repairs were damaged. Yassin Water Station was once a lifeline for thousands. Now, the facility is barely functioning.
The occupation has destroyed more than 72 water wells in Gaza City. Over 150,000 meters of water
right, Jay? Like, what the fuck, man? Whatever happened to personal responsibility?
Reservoirs. The water system has been
ridiculous.
Devastated.
I'm addicted to YouTube. Well, stop watching stupid cat videos, you fat lazy fuck. Jesus Christ. I gotta sue somebody. Fuck off.
Without a stable access to clean water and without equipment and spare parts,
I'll be right back.
Repairs are moving slower than needed.
The United Nations says around 70% of Gaza water system is currently disrupted. Repairs to the Makarot water supply lines have stalled. It lies east of the so-called Yellow Line, where Israeli forces remain deployed. Israel classifies many components needed to repair water and sanitation systems as dual use. That means they can be blocked from entering Gaza on security grounds. Municipal teams say they are working with what they can find.
These pipes, connectors and fittings are essential for maintenance work. We are searching the outskirts of the city for whatever materials we can find and recycling them for repairs.
Doctors say the crisis is causing dehydration, kidney complications, and waterborne diseases.
Water contamination severely affects patients' health. It contains high levels of salts, nitrates, phosphorus, and sulfur.
For residents here, the crisis is measured in hours spent waiting. Children carrying heavy buckets and patients whose condition worsen with every sip of unsafe water. With most crossings, including Rafah, reportedly closed since Israel's war with Iran, the flow of supplies faces further strain. Until repairs can be carried out, access to clean water depends on the next arriving truck. Hani Mahmoud, Al Jazeera, from Gaza City, Palestine.
Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko has begun his first official visit to North Korea. Kim Jong-un welcomed Lukashenko with a pomp-filled ceremony in the capital, Pyongyang. The two leaders then signed a friendship and cooperation treaty. Both countries have helped Russia's war efforts. Kim has provided Moscow with ammunition and troops for its war against Ukraine. Lukashenko allowed Belarus to be used as a launchpad for Russia's invasion in February 2022. Colombia has observed a minute of silence for 69 people killed in a military plane crash earlier this week. President Gustavo Petro joined the service after declaring 3 days of national mourning. The flight had been carrying 126 people and went down near the border with Peru.
What these young people were doing was helping the United States not consume so much cocaine, and that is the first element of analysis. Both the southern neighbor, Ecuador, and the northern neighbor, the US, say we are not doing enough, but the only ones who die are young Colombians, and by the hundreds.
The US state of Minnesota is suing the federal government after January's immigration enforcement operations there. The state is seeking access to the cases of US citizens Renee Nicole Good and Alex Pretty. Federal immigration agents shot and killed them at separate protests in January. The lawsuit accuses the Department of Justice and Homeland Security of blocking state investigators from evidence. Riots in Ecuador's prisons have been routine for years as rival gangs fight for control. 2 years ago, the army took over around a third of the prisons to limit the violence. John Holman reports.
These soldiers are lined up for a regular search on women's prison number 2 near Guayaquil in West Ecuador. The army's taken over many of the country's prisons in an effort to restore order. They've given us rare access to going with them. The army's told us that we have to put on bulletproof vests and also the helmets when we go into the prison. We asked them why, and they said there are weapons inside. Once they get in, they look everywhere. Mattresses ripped open, belongings all over the floor. These soldiers are looking for things that aren't allowed in the prison, but specifically they're looking for cell phones where inmates can call the outside world, and they say do things like extort the population. They're also looking for drugs, and they're looking for weapons. The hiding places can be ingenious. Inmates can hide phones in the actual wall, and then they put some soap on it to seal it back up, and then they paint it back up. So that's what they're trying to find now. For years, prisons have functioned as command centres for the country's gangs to run their operations and extortion rackets. That's led to brutal battles for control of them. The country's seen over 15 prison massacres in the last 5 years. Endemic corruption among prison guards hasn't helped. That's why 2 years ago, the army took over. There's about 700 soldiers at the moment that are in this prison, and what they've told me is that they change out about every month to try and avoid them from being basically corrupted by the inmates. This is only part of the militarization of Ecuador over the past 2 years. Daniel Noboa, the president, has sent the army onto the streets to try and stop the gangs fighting. So far, it's failed. The homicide rate in 2025 was the worst on record in the country. After an initial drop, the riots and
I saw a video that said
continued in prisons
that
too.
when we went in there to hit drug cartels in Ecuador recently, it wasn't cartels, it was like a farm or something. I don't know. Killed a bunch of innocent people.
They have completely reduced the food. The medicine is really limited, and the medical attention since the soldiers came in is zero, because even though they're in charge of us, they can't come close to us or touch us.
Human rights groups say that's happening across army-controlled prisons, and that malnutrition and sickness have been the result. A recent tuberculosis outbreak killed hundreds. But Ecuador's doubling down on the strategy. It's just opened a new maximum security prison as it tries to bring gangs and the prison population under control. John Holman, Al Jazeera, Guayaquil.
Now, the Church of England has officially installed its first female leader. Sari Mullally was appointed as the Archbishop of Canterbury during a ceremony at Canterbury Cathedral in southern England. A former nurse, she is the 106th person to hold the position, which dates back to the 6th century. I'm going to take a short break now. Stay with us. We're back in a couple of minutes.
All right, guys, be right back.
The latest news as it breaks.
Solar panels are being damaged or destroyed. And when the clouds gather, darkness takes over completely.
With detailed coverage.
The front line, once marked by where fighters were, has now become blurred, with drone strikes targeting not only military targets, but schools and hospitals
from around the world.
It's not always possible to divert shipments destined for the Middle East because a new destination may have different requirements.
On Counting the Cost, energy facilities in the Middle East are under attack. Are global gas markets facing a tipping point? As Europe and Asia scramble for supplies, who can fill the gap? Are American companies the biggest winners? And who's paying the price? Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera.
Examining the impact of today's headlines.
The United States has perfect capability of beating any country in the world into a pulp, but it will come at a cost.
Setting the agenda for tomorrow's discussions.
Conflict, it's all created by human beings, so it can all be solved by human beings, if only we can learn to cooperate.
International filmmakers and world-class journalists bring programs to inform and inspire you on Al Jazeera.
Hello, I'm Imran Khan. This is the News Hour live from Doha, coming up in the next 60 minutes.
President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell.
The US tells Iran to accept defeat or face attacks harder than ever before. Iran's foreign minister said there's no intention to negotiate with the US. Abbas Araghchi insists that Tehran is looking for a permanent end to the conflict. And the US
Welcome, everyone.
and Israel have
Please
carried
remember to
out
like
more
and
strikes
subscribe.
on Iran. At least
Thanks for
12 people
joining.
are killed in southern Tehran.
From destruction to diplomacy. On This Is America, we look at what's behind the White House pivot and what message Donald Trump's wartime strategy sends to the American people.
I'll probably be going at least another hour, maybe two. We'll see how it goes.
The US is urging Iran to accept defeat, saying American forces have already crippled much of Tehran's military capability. The White House says President Donald Trump is prepared to, quote, unleash hell if Iran fails to comply. The escalating rhetoric is dimming hopes of any imminent de-escalation as the violence on the ground shows no signs of easing after nearly 4 weeks.
If Iran fails to accept the reality of the current moment, if they fail to understand that they have been defeated militarily and will continue to be, President Trump will ensure they are hit harder than they have ever been hit before. President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell. Iran should not miscalculate again. Their last miscalculation cost them their senior leadership, their Navy, their Air Force, and their air defense system. Any violence beyond this point will be because the Iranian regime refused to understand they have already been defeated and refused to come to a deal.
Now, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi,
Sure.
says no
They've already been
talks have been
defeated.
held with the
Yet
United
they're still
States.
fighting.
He says
They're still there.
exchange of
The
messages
regime's
through
still in charge.
mediators do not amount to negotiations with Washington. Earlier, Iranian diplomatic sources told Al Jazeera that Tehran has received a 15-point US peace proposal. They describe it as unreasonable. US-Israeli attacks have continued on Iran. At least 12 people have been killed in Tehran. Iran has retaliated by striking central and northern Israel. And we have correspondents covering the latest developments from Tehran and Washington, D.C., where we start with Teresa Bow. Now, actually, we're going to go to Mohammed Val in Tehran right now.
Hello.
We're having a little technical difficulties here. Let's go to Teresa Bow, who is in Washington, D.C. for us. Teresa, unleash hell. Those are the words that Caroline Leavitt used. I mean, do we know
She's
what
a
that
stupid
actually means and how it's
Christian
going down
nationalist
in
whore.
Washington, D.C., because a lot of people want an end to this war.
This
in the American
administration's
public.
all bluster, no balls.
Well, certainly, and many would call
Why
it
wouldn't you
coercive
unleash hell on day one of the war?
negotiating from
Now
a
you're going to
position
unleash
of
hell?
strength,
Come on.
keeping the door of war open. During a press conference today at the White House, the press secretary, Caroline leave it. She threatened that if Iran does not agree to some of the terms by the United States, they would unleash hell. And this comes right after Donald Trump has already been saying that right now Iran has an open door for some type of an agreement, saying that if they do not accept it, they're going to be hit harder than they had ever been hit before. And it's all coming around this
He hit him harder first.
plan that apparently has been discussed. It's been presented
Rejected.
by Pakistan in it. It includes ballistic missiles, nuclear weapons.
Iran said, "Fuck off,"
among others. And during this press conference,
they want
press
reparations.
secretary, the White House press secretary, she confirmed that there is a plan in place. However, she said that it's not what is being reported. She said that some elements of it are, but not all of it. She also did not confirm that, for example, some speculation going around about the possibility of Vice President J.D. Vance traveling to Islamabad for some type of a high-level
Vance is against the war.
This has not been confirmed until now. So suddenly the White House continues to threaten Iran using a very strong tone if Iran does not accept these terms, the White House terms. However, as we do know, Iran continues to control the Strait of Hormuz. This has a huge impact on the price of oil. And of course, this also has a huge impact on the Trump administration.
What's oil doing right now?
Stay there. We are going to go now to Mohammed Val, who's live for us in Tehran. Abbas Araghchi has been absolutely clear. There are no talks going on. What more do we know?
Brent's trading at 98 right now.
Oh, that's right. It was a long interview with National State TV, and Abbas Araghchi did not contradict himself.
I'm still making money.
Previous statements. Nothing new in the Iranian stance regarding negotiations, regarding how to end this war. Iran doesn't want a ceasefire, not interested in a ceasefire because they know, he says that a ceasefire they have been talking about over the last several days, including Iran's future control on the Strait of Hormuz, reparations for the destruction and damage that has been inflicted on the country during this war, and also respect of Iran's sovereignty on its national territory, and guarantees that this war will not be repeated in the future. So Iran is asking the other side to respect these terms, and also he said that the fact that there are messages being exchanged through mediation or through other parties doesn't mean that there is an ongoing negotiation between the two sides. And he says that Iran is relying only on its strength. Again, the same message, the same words by the military leaders and by the politicians over the last several days, that Iran is going to fight until the end, until it has its rights and until it is respected and until it can preserve its national territory and sovereignty.
That's Mohammed Val. Stay there. We're going to go back to Teresa Bo. Teresa, there is a big military escalation happening. The 82nd Airborne, rather, is on its way to the Arabian Sea, to the Persian
I don't know why. We destroyed everything.
Something
War's over.
The Americans are welcoming outside of the White House. I'm talking particularly about, the Democrats who have said, we want to end this war.
Well, certainly, and deploying boots on the ground, as it's called here, is highly unpopular in the United States. In fact, there's polls
over 70% people don't want it.
60 to 65% of the population
higher
oppose
than
it,
that.
mostly because of what it means. It brings back memories of the war in Afghanistan, of the war in Iraq, and what
It's another
that
forever
meant.
war in the Middle East.
Certainly
Those
there's
always
lots
go
of
well for
concern
us.
many people in this country about what it means. But we're hearing, for example, we've been reporting of this military buildup over the weekend. 2,500 Marines heading to the Middle East, accompanied by 3 warships. Now we're hearing that the 82nd Airborne Division, which are paratroopers that can be deployed in a period of 24 hours, are heading to the Middle East.
Who's
too.
funded by
And there's lots of
Jewish donors,
speculation about
Jay?
what they're going to be doing.
I mean, they all
Certainly,
are, but-
This is to give the United States leverage because their presence there increases the number of U.S. troops in the region to 50,000. So it's not clear what they're going to be doing? There's speculation that they could be involved, for example, in trying to take over Harq Island, which has been called by the Trump administration as a jewel of the crown, mostly because around 90% of Iranian oil exports come out of there. But of course, just taking it does not mean, whether the United States will be able to hold it, because certainly there's going to be an Iranian defense. So all of this is highly unpopular here, especially when you talk to people on the streets who right now are concerned about the price of oil going up, and they do not want to see American soldiers on the ground. And it brings back memories also about how this war began. We've been, when initially before this war started, we saw that the Omani representative at a point spoke about positive talks, and then the attacks happened. So right now, even though there's negotiations ongoing, everyone here, or nobody, discards that there could be another or stronger military operation on the ground.
Let's go back to Mohammed Val, who is with us in Tehran. Mohammed, it was a very good point that Teresa just made. Whenever there seems to be negotiations taking place, Donald Trump says something like, we are talking to the Iranians, but then, the Abraham Lincoln, for example, the carrier group arrived in the Gulf, and then the 12-day war happened. There is this idea that they are just buying for time, and that's what they may well be doing with the 82nd Airborne and the 31st Marine Expeditionary Force. But what's the reaction from Tehran? What do they think might happen here?
Bet they can't wait.
Well, Imran, the Iranians are very well aware of this situation. They have seen it twice before, and they are watching it right now. That
J.D. Vance, with Thiel. How about Thiel? He's over in Rome talking about the Antichrist.
They have seen it, as I said before, and they know
fucking weirdo, man.
So they are much more.
Yeah, all I know is from what I've read and seen, Vance has been against this operation from day one. He doesn't believe in it. So he's been sidelined pretty much.
I will just read to you a few lines from
Take it for what it's worth.
Speaker of Parliament Mohammed Baqir Qalibaf, in which he said, Iranian parliaments, based on intelligence reports, our enemies are preparing to occupy one of the Iranian islands with support from a regional state. Iranian Parliament Speaker, it says again, our forces are monitoring all enemy movements, and if they take any step, they will target all vital infrastructure of that regional state without mercy. So he is referring here, according to some people explaining what he said, that to the United Arab Emirates, saying that the United Arab Emirates might be cooperating with the Americans and encouraging them to take Harq Island. But also Iranians have been saying over the last few days that they know that if this happens, they are sure that it will be very destructive to that country, the United Arab Emirates, and also the American troops, because it's a small island, it's exposed, and it's very close to the Iranian mainland, and they are threatening that if American troops land on Harq Island, that will be the thing that they are waiting for. That will be very, very detrimental to the safety of American troops.
Mohammed Val, live for us there from Tehran. Now, that's the view from Tehran and from Washington, D.C. But I want to take now a little closer look at the latest U.S. troop deployments. Now, the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli is leaving Taiwan and is scheduled to arrive in the Middle East later this week. The US vessel is carrying the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit with its complement of F-35 stealth jets and about 2,300 Marines. Another assault ship, the USS Boxer, left Southern California last week along with accompanying warships. It's expected to arrive in the region by about mid-April with around 2,200 Marines from the 11th Expeditionary Unit, and about 2,000 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division are expected to deploy to the Middle East in the coming days. Now, joining me in the studio is Ross Harrison. He's a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and author of Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. So we've got, Ross, this diplomacy that seems to be taking place, although the Iranians say it isn't. We've got this troop build-up that is taking place, and the Iranians say, well, we welcome any attempt for a ground invasion. So it seems to be that the diplomacy is being American-led, and so is the military build-up, without actually any talks, real talks. So where do you think that we all stand now, both militarily and diplomatically?
It's really hard to unpack a bit, Imran, but I think one way, there's different ways of thinking about this, and let me try to do that. I think in many ways, after the initial invasion by Israel and the United States on Iran, and after the decapitation strategy, from that point on, Iran started to shape the landscape, the military landscape, because they widened the war. And that was not predetermined. I mean, any of us that understood Iran knew that that was going to happen, but that was not the expectation, at least from what we understand of the United States. So Iran kind of took that initiative. And so, yes, it appears right now that the Americans are controlling the diplomacy and the military piece, but that's because the Americans are talking a lot about it, right? One of the things that I think is important for viewers to understand is that diplomacy is normally not carried out in tweets or in messages. They're usually carried out because right now what's happening is both sides are digging their heels in publicly. And that's hard to walk back from. And that's the reason, generally, diplomats will not do that. They will look behind the scenes to test each other's out positions and then decide
you can't trust Vance. And the whole Erica Kirk thing with him is creepy as fuck.
A lot of different
Creepy as
15-point
fuck.
plans on the part of the United States, 3 or 4 point
Yeah,
plans.
you can't trust what Iran says. You can't trust what Trump says because they're all insane.
We don't know what's happening behind the scenes.
Kabuki theater.
But we do know that there are the facts on the ground indicate that either these deployments that you mentioned coming from Japan and California are either there as a flexing of a muscle or more worrisome that there's going to be, despite all of the talk of diplomacy, there is going to be some kind of a military escalation here. And the concern is that the Iranians so far have escalated horizontally, but they also have the option to escalate vertically, which means if the United States takes an island and bombs power plants, the risk is that they then start using terrorist methods and cyber methods, and you start to have not just a geographic expansion, but an actual kinetic expansion, and that's the risk.
Every military analyst,
everybody blows up
every
everybody.
assessment that I've read about
Thanks, Trump.
troops on the ground suggests that for a country of 92 million, which is going to fight back on the ground, that knows the country very well, and the Americans don't, is going to require something like 250 to 300,000 US troops backed up by all the requisite weaponry, a supply route. It's almost impossible to think you can do that from Clark Island, which is an oil terminal, effectively. So that can't be a realistic strategy, surely?
Well, it could be a realistic strategy depending on what their goal is. If the goal is regime change, which was certainly the Israeli stated goal, and to some degree the U.S. is, I mean, you can't figure out what the actual goal is of the United States because it's not clear and it keeps moving. But I think there are some limited things that the military can do. Now, the question is, if they occupy Karg Island, or they take some position near Bandar Abbas and try to control the strait, what does it do politically or even economically? Because the strait, the only way the strait is going to normalize is if it's no longer a combat zone. So if the U.S. is putting ships there, it's now, right now the Iranians are choking it off, but there's no real military conflagration there. All of a sudden now it becomes a magnet for military conflagration. What does that do in terms of the stated objective of opening up the strait? It does not. Maybe long term it would, but it doesn't. Karg Island, I don't know what that would do. So it's not clear what the objective is. I can tell you that one of the things that the Iranians have been doing since the 12-day war is they've been decentralizing decision-making to prepare for the fact that for this decapitation approach that the Israelis and the Americans have had. And more than likely, I don't know this, but more than likely, they're also decentralizing their military. So my hunch is that they are preparing for this, and they've got roughly 150 to 200,000 revolutionary
It's all well
guards
and good, Daniel, but Trump doesn't give a shit about the Iranian people.
According to Donald Trump, everything is destroyed.
They're never going to get any of that, not under him.
So it will be
Trump's not interested in trying to remove this regime.
Let's talk about the wild card.
And they're not going to surrender on their own. So the Iranian people are fucked.
Now, Israel cannot
They're fucked today, they're fucked tomorrow, they're fucked for the rest of their lives.
May well surprise us all and go for a peace deal with Iran, a comprehensive one. But what does that mean for Israel? Is there an opportunity here for Israel to get the US to back off?
Thanks, Eric.
On
Don't
its
forget to
actions
like
in
and
Lebanon,
subscribe, buddy.
in the occupied West Bank, in Gaza, as part of that deal?
Well, you're absolutely right, Imran, that
Thanks for showing
Israel's
up.
the wild card here. You're right. I mean, Israel can take action against Iran independently. It has been doing that in conjunction with the United States. But I think the point is, if the United States, as you say, if Donald Trump strikes a deal and says we're over, the Israeli campaign, is, at least with Iran, is also finished at that point in time. It would be very interesting to see. The Israelis might believe that Iran has been weakened. I think I'm not sure that's true, but they might feel that way. And that might liberate them to go deeper into Lebanon and occupy the West Bank, whatever it is. Question is, what does it mean for, and with no other president that I know of would give them license to do that. But let's assume Donald Trump would do that. This is the one president that might do that. If that's the case, then the question, what does it do with the Iranians? The Iranians are patient. They're not patient now, but they would be if they can survive and recreate deterrence. If they have patience, they'll figure this is speculation, they might figure that they can reconstruct some connection either using the Houthis or the Hashd-e-Shaabi or eventually rehabilitate Hezbollah. The question is, would the Iranians keep escalating in order to preserve Hezbollah? I'm not sure they would. But it's a fascinating question, and we may see it playing out over the next couple of weeks.
Well, Ross, we'll talk about that in the next hour as well, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Imran.
Now, Iran continued to strike targets inside Israel on Wednesday. An Iranian missile landed near the city of Haifa, sending
And
a
MAGA
balloon
loves it
smoke
for
into
him.
the sky.
Loves
Elsewhere,
him
a
for
missile
it.
caused a huge fire at the warehouse in the town of Yasharesh. Israel's continued to target Beirut. Strikes have also hit several towns and cities in southern Lebanon. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he's expanding what he calls a buffer zone in Lebanon.
We have created a genuine security zone that does not allow a ground
War
infiltration
criminal,
towards the Galilee
warmonger.
or the northern border. We are expanding the security zone to push the threat from anti-tank missiles on our communities and on our territory. We are simply creating a large buffer zone.
Now, Iraq has summoned the top U.S. diplomat in Baghdad. That's after an airstrike on a military clinic in Anbar province, west of the capital. Iraq's defense ministry says at least 7 fighters were killed and 13 were wounded, and the government has called it a serious violation of international law. It says it reserves the right to respond. Will also file a formal complaint with the United Nations. Now, financial markets remain volatile as investors weigh up the prospects of an end to the war. Major U.S. indices rose early on Wednesday after President Trump suggested diplomatic efforts with Iran were making progress. Now, they've since pared back some of the gains. The global oil benchmark price has dropped below $100 a barrel before climbing back up. But the Trump administration says oil from the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve has been released to alleviate rising prices linked to the war with Iran. The U.S. intends to release the second largest amount in history after supplies through the Strait of Hormuz caused disruptions. Our chief U.S. correspondent, Alan Fisher, explains.
The oil from the U.S. Strategic Reserve is flowing now into the refineries dotted along the Gulf Coast. Soon, it will be finding its way across America to the U.S. consumers who've experienced price shocks since the war with Iran began. They've opened the taps on 172 million barrels, the second biggest release in its history.
There's a lot of oil out there. That'll get healed very quickly.
The U.S. Strategic Reserve holds more oil than any other country in the world, up to 714
Doesn't matter
million
if you
barrels.
can't refine it.
Right now, it's sitting about 415 million barrels, according to the Energy Department. The US burns through roughly 20 million barrels a day, about the same amount that usually flows through the Strait of Hormuz. There are 4 main sites,
I agree,
2 in
Jay.
Texas, 2 in Louisiana, and they're all near the country's largest refineries and major pipelines. That allows oil to flow quickly when it's needed. Being close to the Gulf also makes shipping, importing, and distributing oil along the coast much easier. The reserve is tucked deep underground, stored in massive salt caverns, perfect for keeping oil safe over the long haul. The reserve was set up after the 1970s Arab embargo to protect the country from supply shocks. Presidents have leaned on the SPR during global crises.
This is a wartime bridge to increase oil supply.
None of this is going to help with prices at the pump.
Joe Biden
None
tapped
of
it in 2022,
It
releasing
didn't do anything.
180 million barrels after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the biggest drawdown in the reserve's history. Barack Obama took out 30 million barrels in 2011 to offset supply disruptions from the civil war in Libya. George H.W. Bush authorised 34 million barrels during the first Gulf War. This current release leaves the SPR at around 60% of capacity, but still one of the largest emergency stockpiles in the world, and something the President has promised to address.
We will start at the appropriate time, which is basically a gut instinct. We will start filling up the strategic...
Well, he's got a big enough gut.
Forecourts are becoming
Instincts,
more common
not so
because
much.
the cost of
Bad
fuel
ones,
has risen
not
since the
really
start
good
of
ones.
The war in Iran. People are feeling the pain.
Releasing
at the
all this
pumps.
oil is just a
But
waste.
That's what the strategic reserve is for. It's a crucial backup when global markets are shaky, and a useful tool when prices start to get too high. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera.
Not a useful
Washington.
tool.
Now, Iraq has some of the world's largest oil reserves, but the money it earns doesn't fully flow through Baghdad. Instead, a system set up by the US invasion in 2003 still gives Washington lasting leverage over Iraq's oil revenues. Now, Osama bin Javed explains all of that.
One of the richest oil fields in the world is in southern Iraq. It's called Majnoon, which means crazy.
Another
in
war
Arabic.
for oil.
But what's equally
Go
crazy
figure.
is that the revenue from this oil field and others like it is controlled by the United States.
Of course it
America
is.
doesn't own them. It doesn't pump the crude, but more than 2 decades after its invasion, it retains influence over Iraq's most important source of income. This has real-world consequences for Iraqi politics and the economy, and on how Baghdad balances domestic interests with US expectations. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the US imposed a new financial structure on energy revenue, mandating that proceeds from oil and gas sales be paid into the Development Fund for Iraq, or DFI. The fund was based at the New York Federal Reserve Bank, so Iraqi oil revenue remained outside Iraq. The DFI eventually became an account of the Central Bank of Iraq. Legally, this money belongs to Iraq, but operationally it continues to pass through American financial and regulatory systems, meaning the US controls the financial plumbing through which Iraqi oil revenues flow. On paper, this doesn't violate Iraqi sovereignty, but in practice, it gives the US a semi-permanent hold on Iraq's economy. From the start, the spending of
And
these
it helps
funds
our
was
economy
paid
in the short
before
term.
Oversight. Between 2004 and 2007, the
We
US
could put a
Department
stop
of
to the
Defense
flow of
did
that
not
money at
properly
any time
account
if
for
we need it.
$2.6 billion of the $9.1 billion, nearly a third of Iraq's oil revenue for that period. That's according to the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction. It also found that the remaining more than $6 billion was poorly managed. Not just administrative negligence, it set a precedent that Iraq's own revenues could be administered outside Iraqi institutions. To date, revenue remains in dollar accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, creating a structural dependency. It goes further. Iraqi government reports suggest US officials have warned Baghdad Washington could restrict Iraq's access to oil revenues if Iran-aligned political actors make the Iraqi government. Blocking or delaying access to dollar-dominated oil revenue could cripple the economy. Iraq cannot bypass the US dollar system. Its financial system is dollarized, meaning the local currency's value is pegged, and its central bank and government must comply with US anti-money laundering and sanctions norms to access their own money. Analysts say Washington can use this as a bargaining chip in negotiations, particularly when it comes to Iraq's relationships with Iran and domestic militia groups.
There you
This is
go.
not theoretical. It is leverage rooted in Washington's regulatory authority over the global financial system. There's an important distinction here, as the US does not own Iraqi oil fields. US companies do not control production or export volumes, and Iraq remains responsible for signing oil contracts and setting output through its national institutions. The leverage is financial and regulatory, not military occupation or seizure of assets, and it gives the US a chokehold over Iraq's core national revenue stream. It's also a tool of geopolitical pressure, which can be used to influence how Baghdad balances relations with Tehran, Moscow, and domestic political coalitions.
The AP is reporting that the Trump administration is going to give Michael Flynn $1.2 million to settle a lawsuit over Russiagate.
And in Iraq, the US holds
He was
the
a
money
spy.
from the oil.
He did prison time. But he's one of Trump's buddies, so they're going to give him money, of course.
Time for some of the day's other top stories now. A Los Angeles jury has found Google and Meta liable
Here we
for
go.
$3 million in damages in a landmark lawsuit. The case involves a 20-year-old woman who said the design of Google's YouTube and Meta's Instagram led her becoming addicted at a young age. The jury found both tech companies
I agree,
negligent
Sandy.
in failing to warn about the dangers of the apps. The verdict could pave the way for thousands more cases against major tech companies. The UN General
Ridiculous.
Assembly has paused a resolution to recognize slavery as the gravest crime against humanity. The resolution proposed by Ghana also calls for reparations. Al Jazeera's Gabriel Elizondo reports from the UN headquarters in New York.
While General Assembly resolutions are not legally binding, this resolution is meant to set the legal foundation, recognizing that the transatlantic slave trade was the gravest crime against humanity. It also calls for reparations. Now, this resolution passed overwhelmingly with the support of over 120 countries. It was an initiative of Ghana.
History, as we know, is rarely simple. It is layered, it is complex, and at times uncomfortable. This resolution does not deny that complexity. It does not ignore the many dimensions of historical experience. Rather, it recognizes that even within complexity, there are moments in history that stand apart, moments defined by their scale, their systemization, and their impact on humanity. To acknowledge this is not to diminish any other history. It is to deepen our collective moral awareness.
While the resolution passed overwhelmingly, more than 50 countries abstained, most notably France.
We regret that this resolution seems to establish a hierarchy amongst crimes against humanity. This gives rise to serious legal difficulties and runs the risk of creating a competition against historic tragedies that should not be compared and done to the detriment of victims.
The European Union, as a bloc, decided to abstain, citing what they called legal and factual problems with the draft. The only 3 countries to vote against this resolution: Israel, Argentina, and the United States. Gabriel Elizondo, Al Jazeera, at the United Nations in New York.
Now,
Trump's a racist.
soldiers have been killed in Nigeria in an ambush
On top
by
of everything
armed groups.
else.
One police officer and a
Racist,
resident
pedophile.
also killed in an attack in northwestern state of Kebbi. No group has claimed responsibility, but some locals believe Islamic State Sahel province was behind it. It's the latest in a series of violent attacks where armed groups frequently target security forces and remote communities in areas with limited security presence. Colombia has observed a minute of silence for 69 people who were killed in a military plane crash earlier this week. President Gustavo Petro joined the service after declaring 3 days of national mourning. The flight had been carrying 126 people and went down near the border with Peru. Petro also used the occasion to underscore the human cost Colombia has paid to curb drug trafficking. An attempt to break a stalemate in the US Congress over Department of Homeland Security funding has failed again. Since the deadlock began in February, security checkpoints at airports are going understaffed. Hundreds of unpaid transportation security administration workers are quitting or calling out sick. That's meant hours long waits at
They're not getting
airports
paid.
across the country.
Of course they're calling
The
out
dispute
sick.
began when Democrats demanded Republicans agree to reforms to ICE
Trump,
immigration enforcement. The Trump
Republicans,
administration
Democrats
has
have a
deployed
deal
ICE
on the table,
officers
and Trump
to
said no.
assist the TSA.
So can't blame Democrats. They're willing to fund this. Just not ICE. And Trump says no deal.
Archbishop of Canterbury during a ceremony
Pass
at
the SAVE
Canterbury
Act.
Cathedral in southern England. A former nurse, she's the 106th person to hold the position, which dates back to the 6th century. Archbishop Malali's appointment has been opposed by the Anglican Church's very conservative wing. You're watching Al Jazeera, a reminder of our latest development in the conflict that's engulfed much of the Middle East. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has warned Iran that President Donald Trump's prepared to unleash
This stupid
hell
bleach blonde
if Iran
bitch.
doesn't accept his terms for a ceasefire.
What a waste of skin.
Leavitt has also said that through diplomatic back channels have not hit a dead end. Iran has said it's received a 15-point US peace proposal and called it unreasonable. Tehran has demanded guarantees that the war will not resume after an agreement and compensation for damages. The US and Israel are keeping up attacks on Iran. At least 12 people have been killed in the south of Tehran. Now let's go to Washington, D.C. for our regular segment from the U.S. Capitol, bringing you deeper insights into the debates that are shaping America and the world. Let's go to Phil and Anna for This Is America.
Hello, this is America, where the war in Iran is being largely directed from the White House, just blocks from this very studio, actually. But what direction is it actually heading in? From talk of attacks to actual attacks to talk of talks, where's it all going? And what is behind this apparent pivot by President Trump to diplomacy? Lots to unpack with both me and Anna Burns-Francis.
Thanks, Phil. Another vote to end the war failed in the Senate last night, but will it even be needed? In a moment, we're going to cross to our correspondents. Kimberly Halkett is live for us at the White House, and Patty Culhane is live on Capitol Hill with the latest developments. Donald Trump's declared victory over Iran multiple times over the past few weeks. The conflict is still going, but the volley of missiles,
What is
airstrikes
victory
and drones has
in
calmed
Trump's
down.
mind?
And the president's announced
He's
a
insane.
5-day ceasefire of sorts. Presented as a reprieve to Iran, Trump has walked back a weekend threat to bomb the regime's power plants, saying diplomatic efforts were underway. But like all previous statements around this war, the messaging has been mixed. And as the American public looks for clarity around why the president's decided now is the time to head back to the negotiating table, it may be statements he's made in the past that offer the best clue.
Of the wounded and send our immense love and eternal gratitude to the families of the fallen. And sadly, there will likely be more.
Dementia on
Before it
camera,
ends,
folks.
that's the way it is.
And I've long
Jesus.
said that, I wonder whether or not NATO would ever be there for us. So this was a great test.
It's
we
not
don't
their
need 'em,
war.
but they should have
It's
been
your
there.
war.
But oil prices are already coming back down, and it's
Are
going to
they?
come down. But we're not leaving until that job is finished, and it's going to be very fast.
Lives lost, a lack of ally support, or skyrocketing oil
No
prices.
clear goal, man.
Whatever
They're
the reason,
winging it,
it's
Jay.
not
They're just winging
unreasonable
it.
to
They don't
assume
know.
public polling is
One
also
day it's
having a
regime
say
change.
on
Next
which way
day
the
it's we're helping
president decides to
Israel. The
go.
next day it's we're
Just
going to protect
1/3 of
the
Americans
oil.
approve of how
They
Donald
don't
Trump is
fucking know.
handling the conflict, and most of them are Republicans. When it comes to the far-reaching impacts of this war, nearly 90% blame the conflict driving up the cost of fuel, a concern shared amongst Trump's base. 91% of them saying the war is impacting prices at the pump.
Good.
That base will, of course, look to the president for answers. So let's cross now live to our correspondent.
Better look
Kimberly
somewhere
Halkett, who
else.
joins us from the White House. Kimberly, has Donald Trump given any indication as to why he made the call to back
Trump is
off from
completely
military action
fucking
and
the
return to
GOP's
mediation?
chances in November. This is a nightmare for them.
Is what we have been told by the White House press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. And what she says is that the reason that there has been this pivot has to do with what she says is the success of Operation Epic Fury, or the name for the military campaign, calling it
What
a
success?
military triumph. She said it was projected to last 4 to 6 weeks, but after 25 days, the military campaign's already met its core objectives. And so as a result, now
What are those
the
objectives?
feeling is that there can be these diplomatic discussions. Now, what she said, though, however, is that she believes that, and the president believes, that it is Iran looking for an exit ramp. That's why she says the president decided on Saturday evening that this should be a discussion that should move forward, and that this should continue in terms of a postponement of strikes. Now, having said that, we should point out that 15-point plan that the United States had reportedly given to Iran, the White House denying that is the case, saying there are elements of truth to it, and also on the rumors that the J.D. Vance could be going to Islamabad. The White House, again, would not confirm, would only say that those talks could happen.
Okay, something to watch. Let's bring in Patty Culhane here. Patty, how much of the concern from lawmakers here on Capitol Hill has pushed Trump to this turning point?
I don't think any of it at all, because he's really not getting any pushback from Republicans. You mentioned there was just 24 hours ago another vote in the Senate to invoke the War Powers Resolution, which would basically say the war has to end right now. It failed 53 to 47. One Democrat, one Republican crossed to vote with the other party. But again, as you mentioned, polling shows Republicans voters are the only group that approves of this war, even if the majority of Americans don't. So there's not a lot of pressure, not a lot of incentive for these members of Congress to buck the president on this. So that could change if two things happen. If the prices of gas continue to climb, they're driving prices up for pretty much everything. And then the other thing is if he invokes ground forces. If you look at one poll, about half Republicans say that, for them, would be a step too far.
Right, Patty Culhane joining us from Capitol Hill and Kimberly Halkett at the White House. Thank you both. The Trump administration's already sent Iran a list of conditions to end the conflict. They may deny it, but Tehran says it's already rejected the 15-point proposal, leaving the United States to weigh up its next move. Here's Richard Gaisford.
He's the president who always wants to win, but to do that in Iran, does he need to change his approach to the game? The ball is in play, and Trump's presidential seal is stamped all over it. With what many perceive to be an unclear strategy, the president might be about to reshape his support team and his tactics to try and achieve a rare hole-in-one. It's reported Donald Trump's golf partner Steve Witkoff, his special envoy to the Middle East, and son-in-law Jared Kushner could be handing over lead negotiations to J.D. Vance, who's seen as a skeptic about the war.
Our interest, I think, very much is in not going to war with Iran, right? It would be a huge distraction of resources. It would be
that was less than 2 years ago. Could the vice president now be the man to help end it?
Nobody likes war, right? And I guarantee the President of the United States is not interested in getting us, in the kind of long-term quagmires that we've seen in years past.
The rising price of petrol is certainly fueling disquiet across America. Opinion polls and pressure from industry and big US companies could mean domestic issues dictate a change after what's reported to be indirect communications with Iran. Any future direct talks would center on the US desire to end Iran's nuclear program, for it to remove ballistic missiles and reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran will demand guarantees that the war will end permanently, ask for economic reparations, and that it will maintain control over all its territory. Whether the Americans, though, can contain and control their Israeli allies is the key question.
President Trump believes there is a possibility to leveraging the mighty achievements obtained by the IDF and the U.S. military in order to realize the goals of the war in a deal that will preserve our vital interests.
As calls grow around the world to de-escalate a conflict that's crippling oil flows and economies, the president continues to talk tough.
We're doing a 5-day period. We'll see how that goes. And if it goes well, we're going to end up with settling this. Otherwise, we'll just keep bombing our little hearts out.
The end of the 5-day pause coincides with the arrival of more warships and thousands of U.S. Marines in the region. As it pushes for peace talks, America's strengthening its military presence in the Middle East. All options are on the table now as President Trump gets ready to make his next move. Richard Gaisford, Al Jazeera, Washington.
Well, as for our next move, what is driving the shift from Donald Trump's attacks on Iran to diplomacy? Let's head back to Phil in the newsroom.
Yeah, you watch the TV networks, you read the newspapers, there are 3 words that will jump out a lot: oil, markets, and money. So you can see where all of this is heading. Let's let fortune set out the stall. Look, Trump searches for an exit strategy in Iran as $100 oil looms over the midterms. And it goes on to say this: American voters won't tolerate high gasoline prices for long. Remember that word voters, because we're going to come back to that. The Iranians have figured out that control of the Strait of Hormuz is their most effective weapon against the US and Israel's bombing of Tehran. Now, the reason I said remember voters is because when we go to NPR, they are talking about the midterms on their podcast. These are local elections, people picking their local representatives in November, but many were going to see this as a referendum on Donald Trump so far and what's happened in Iran. And that's what they lent into on their show.
During his first term, when he left office, he had a 50%
approval rating when it came to his handling of the economy, and it was never below 47% in our NPR PBS News Marist poll. So this is a totally new position for him to have to try to figure out how to deal with, and his party are going to be the ones who are going to deal with the political consequences.
Next up, it is CNN. The headline there, Trump's suspiciously timed announcements on Iran. Remember, again, suspiciously, because that takes us to this article. The announcement of talks made 2 hours before the open of US trading on Monday resulted in a rally on Wall Street. Again, tying it back to finance, a sharp slide in the price of Brent crude, both areas that have been causing heartburn for Trump and his advisors. And there's more from CNN. It goes on to say the possibility that something else motivated him to back down. That's their speculation.
I've been talking, and I have my mic muted.
That such a move could escalate.
Jay, if you're still here, yep, seen as a skeptic.
Pain. Right, sticking with television, we're going to go to MS
Trump
Now.
is manipulating the market
Now, it is a
on
progressive
purpose
network here in the
for the
United
benefit
States.
of himself and his family and
MSNBC until recently
his
when
big money
rebranded, but
donors.
kept a number of the same faces, including Lawrence O'Donnell. He was talking to this Democrat who said, this is not about Trump pivoting towards diplomacy. This is about Trump realizing that he's got no other options.
That Iran can take our best punch. I mean, it hurts, certainly it has weakened them, but it's not going to topple the regime. So now what? I mean, if you walk into a room and the only play you got with the guy you're dealing with basically is to punch him in the face, and you do so, and he just keeps smiling back at you, then what? And that's where we're at right now.
From the left to the right, this is Breitbart. If you don't know Breitbart,
That's right.
it is a conservative.
All they have to do is not
website.
lose.
It's got links to the Trump administration. At various times, people have gone to work for the administration to Breitbart and vice versa. It targets conservative millennials, who are a big demographic here. And its daily podcast is led by its editor-in-chief, who said this is for Donald Trump in his mind, realizing that he's got the upper hand and he needs to capitalize on that now.
Considering just the nature of how unpopular these types of things are at home, considering anyone who opposes Trump in general is not going to like this war, and then considering many of Trump's coalition members, particularly newer coalition members, are very anti-war, particularly in the Middle East, it's important to make sure we're wrapping this thing up as soon as humanly possible, especially considering we've got all these bragging rights.
Finally, we're going to take it over to Bloomberg. The headline there, Trump began Iran talks as allies warned war risked disaster. And it goes on to flesh this out with this. Regional partners told the US that permanent damage to Iranian infrastructure would almost inevitably result in a failed state after the conflict ended. Of course, failed state, two words that Donald Trump is unlikely to want to hear, because that opens up a whole world of extra problems. It's less security for the world, potentially more wars, potentially troop deployments, and that could lead to more protracted.
And it makes it worse for the Iranian people.
And that is
much
far
worse
from the short, sharp shock that this conflict was initially portrayed out to be.
Well, it's safe to say the pressure has been coming from all sides, but who has Trump been listening to the most? Joining us today to discuss is
himself.
Bando, former special assistant
He said
to
that in the
President
past.
Ronald Reagan, and Victoria
He talks
Taylor,
to
former
himself.
US Deputy Assistant Secretary for Iraq.
He's the
and
smartest
Iran
person
at the
he
Bureau
knows.
of Near Eastern Affairs. Thank you both for coming in. Doug, I'll start with you. Is this shift back towards diplomatic efforts a concession that the war and that escalating the conflict failed?
I think so. Donald Trump believed this would be a very short war. He talked about surrender. He talked about the Iranians consulting him and choosing their next leader. All of those are out the window. And what he's found is
all of those were lies.
That Iran has been able to devastate America's partners in the region, as well as effectively close the Strait of Hormuz. Both of these are causing enormous harm around the world. He's got to do something, and I think the diplomatic option is his best one.
Victoria, I'll bring you in here. What are
Yes,
the
he
things
is.
that we've looked at
Complete
a number of
clown.
throughout the program already, but what are the things that
And he's
you
running a
think
circus.
has influenced Donald Trump to get to this point?
Well, I think President Trump has always had really two competing influence, both a desire to reach a negotiated solution, to reach a deal, but then also this willingness to use a really decisive military force. And so I think both of those instincts have been there throughout his administration and throughout this conflict. And I think right now we're seeing him kind of approach both options, as he's both sending more troops to the Middle East right now at the same time as the administration's sending feelers out to the Iranians via the Pakistanis.
They're competing interests, though, aren't they, Doug? You can't bomb someone and want to negotiate with them at the same time.
Well, it certainly makes it harder. And if I was an
Yes,
Iranian...
not warmly received, I probably
Exactly.
should have
I
put.
mean, if I was an Iranian, I wouldn't trust the president. They negotiated
Bombings will
with him
continue
last
until
year, they
morale
bombed them,
improves.
and they were negotiating this year in February when he bombed them. So that's going to make the diplomatic option harder. You know, you can use the military to try to push somebody into a negotiation, but at some point, if they don't trust you, it's pretty hard to come to an agreement.
Lawmakers, in particular Democrats, have been quick to criticize the president for not only failing to consider the American public, but also to consult it.
There is no question this is war. They have contempt for the American people. They have contempt for the American people because they think that they can carry out the biggest war in the Middle East since Iraq and Afghanistan without a single vote, without a single discussion in the public.
Victoria, Donald Trump is still moving troops into the Gulf region. Is that a sign that things are going to ramp up again?
I think I could see it go either way. And I think, again, that just goes back to President Trump's own competing instincts. But also, I think part of this reflects maybe a misunderstanding about the Iranian regime and their own decision-making. This idea that increased pressure will ultimately force the Iranians to capitulate. I think the Iranians feel actually very confident right now. They've demonstrated the regime will survive, even with the death of the supreme leader, and they believe that they could outlast the United States. Really, all they have to do to win is to outlast the United States.
Doug, Victoria used a word there, I think it was misunderstanding.
Win by not losing.
You've both been in the administrations of past presidents. How do you get to a misunderstanding in an administration that has for years dealt with the issue of Iran?
Well, I think the personality of the president matters. And
is that the biggest influencing factor
To my
here?
mind, that's probably most important here. The question is, what information do you bring to him? How do you assess it? How do you make the argument? And how does he take it? You know, this is somebody who clearly, I think in part because of the Venezuela experience, probably overestimated. The U.S. military is extraordinary. I have a nephew who's a SEAL. I can attest to that. My father was in the Air Force. But it can't do everything. And I think he looked at that and thought they can go into Iran, do this quickly, you know, the Israelis can take out the supreme leader, and I'll get a surrender. But Iran is very, very different from Venezuela, and they've proved that disastrously, I think, for the administration's plans.
Victoria, do you see this pivot as a delay tactic?
Well, I think that, you know, ultimately, I think the pressure on oil prices on the global economy, you know, the pressure that the administration is facing from parts of the MAGA movement, who, of course, have been against protracted conflicts, are certainly putting pressure on the president to find a way to end this. But again, I think the difficulty here is that President Trump thinks that he can, and the administration thinks that they can really impose the terms. And Tehran has demonstrated by closing the Straits of Hormuz that they have an extremely powerful pressure point. And thus far, I've not seen signs that the Iranians think that they need to make big concessions to end this conflict.
Yeah, you mentioned there Donald Trump's loyal voters and followers. One factor that has become almost a daily talking point is the price of gas. Even the vice president is acutely aware that the conflict and the flow-on increase in oil prices is becoming a problem.
Gas prices are up. And we know they're up, and we know that people are hurt.
You got that right, Joseph.
And we're doing everything that we can to ensure that they stay lower.
Doug,
they're the ones manipulating the market, probably,
right?
with his help.
I remember hearing an anecdote a long time ago about Biden's chief of staff.
They're going to make all their money.
Gas stations
Stay
every
safe.
day on the way to work to check what the price was. How much has increasing oil prices had an impact on what we're now seeing happen?
Well, this matters a lot, especially because the American people have felt affordability is an issue.
It was already a problem, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
The president ran on that. It's one reason he defeated Joe Biden or Kamala Harris. So to have this rising gas prices against him, I think especially in an election year where Republicans are thought to be on the defensive, you know, that makes it much, much worse and has pushed him, I think, pretty hard to try to find a diplomatic settlement.
Yeah. Victoria, do you
He
agree
massively
on that,
miscalculated
oil
this
prices
entire
play
move.
Such a role here to
Massively. And it's going to cost him
quite
dearly in
important.
November.
It's always been a number that has really resonated with the American public and that lawmakers and politicians have really looked at. And I think, you know, President Trump having a significant segment of his base which is anti-conflict, you know, who was opposed to the Iraq War, opposed to the Afghanistan War, also don't want to see a protracted long-term war in the Middle East. And so there is pressure on the president to try to find a way to bring this to a close, especially as I think the regime has demonstrated it's going.
Come on. Let's go.
You can have intermediaries and that can help. They don't have to directly talk initially. You can set up some parameters for discussion. You can find areas of agreement. I'm very happy. It was Omanis before. Now we're apparently looking at Pakistan and some Turkey, some other countries potentially. I'm all for bringing in other countries if we can. Settling this diplomatically obviously is the best hope for everyone. It's not going to be easy. Let's get as many reinforcements as we can.
Victoria, we have seen European allies reluctant to become involved. How does that relate to, or impact rather, the relationship that they have from this moment on? It's the likes of Pakistan getting involved in negotiating.
Well, I think since the beginning of this administration and even during President Trump's first term, he's had a very frosty relationship with the Europeans. And I don't think the Europeans are really the key parties right now. I think it's the countries in the Gulf, countries like Turkey, countries like Saudi Arabia, like Qatar, where the leaders have been able to establish quite strong relations with the president. And these countries are the ones with the most at stake right now. Of course, many countries in the Gulf have been directly hit by Iran, are still taking incoming strikes. And so I think these countries are the ones who will play the key role in shaping the president's decision-making.
In terms of decision-making, Doug, and this is a pivotal moment, not just in the direction of the war, but the involvement of parties in the war. We know that this is not just a US war. There is a joint operation here with Israel. How much does its influence and its objectives cause a problem for Donald Trump in finding a way out of this conflict?
Well, I think the difficulty is that Israel does have its own agenda. It really wants regime change, and I think that Benjamin Netanyahu would be perfectly happy if Iran fell into civil war, if there was a collapse. He's not so concerned about that instability. I think Donald Trump is, and certainly the Gulf countries are. So the challenge is the president willing to tell Israel to stop when he wants to stop, and is Israel willing to do so? The U.S. potentially has a lot of influence there, but in the past, the president has been somewhat hesitant to use that, and Netanyahu has been quite persuasive in dealing with the president. So that's a challenge, that if you are going to war with somebody, if you can't come to a conclusion in terms of when to end the war, then there's a problem.
Yeah, Victoria, if that's on one side, on one shoulder of President Trump, on the other, we might expect that these Gulf allies who have been subjected to Iran's retaliatory attacks will also be wanting to have a say here. What kind of influence do they have in the situation?
Well, I think one interesting factor here is that there's a kind of a growing body of reporting suggesting that some Gulf leaders and some Gulf countries are essentially telling President Trump, now that you've started this, you need to finish the job. And so I think, many of us question exactly what that means. It likely does not mean regime change, but I think that they would like to see the U.S. administration ensure that they have really effectively dismantled the regional threat that Iran can play. But those are very different objectives, as Doug said, than the Israeli objective.
And the problem will be, Doug, is that Iran itself has not given any indication that it intends to come to the table, that it's interested in being the proactive force to bring an end to this conflict.
Why would they?
The challenge is that for Iran, the critical issue is how do you prevent this from happening again? So they want assurances. And there's a lot of talk, they want reparations and other things, but to my mind, the most important issue for them is if we stop now, how do we ensure it doesn't happen again? Well, what kind of credible guarantees could the U.S. give, and would the U.S. be willing to do so?
I wouldn't trust Trump to give any guarantees.
Far apart on where they want this war to end, and that remains
It's a duplicitous piece of shit.
Victoria, then I'll give you the last question here. Is this a defining moment in this war?
I'm not sure that we've seen the end of this. And I think certainly we're seeing indications from President Trump and his team that they're looking for a diplomatic path out. But ultimately, we've not seen a softening of positions, either on the American side or the Iranian side. And so without more of a sense of compromise, I think it will be difficult at this exact moment to reach a deal that could bring the conflict to a close.
Victoria Taylor and Doug Bando, thank you both for coming in. Well, this week's surprise pivot by President Trump's been in the spotlight online. Alex Baird has been following the debate.
Well, the burning question online, how did Trump go from this, a 48-hour threat to obliterate Iran's power plants, to just 35 hours later, this. That very good and productive diplomacy
Taco.
with Iran was
Free
back
tacos
on,
for
and
everyone.
a 5-day
Trump loves
stand-down on those
tacos.
initial threats. The problem, Iran says those talks aren't even happening. This video from Iran's army saying you are negotiating with yourselves and don't call your defeat an agreement. Commentator Ed Krasenstein questioning all sides. I don't know who to believe, the Iranian government who has lied repeatedly over the years, or Trump who has lied repeatedly over the years. The theories as to Trump's pivot coming in hot and fast. Former Marine Corps intelligence officer Scott Ritter thinks it's all just a panicked reaction.
We, on the other hand, have been changing our plan every day for 4 weeks now.
Some
And
predicting Trump is just buying time to prepare for a ground invasion, or that the president's scared of fluctuations in the US market. Joe Kent, who just quit as the director of the National Counterterrorism Center,
And he's a
saying
psycho.
perhaps Trump's actually trying to make peace. Regardless, foreign policy expert Robert Malley believes it's now clear that the threat of Iran's bite was far worse than Trump's bark.
Well, that's all from Washington, D.C. On This Is America, we'll keep following the decisions that shape the US and influence the world, particularly during the US and Israel's war with Iran. You can, as always, find more on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Al Jazeera English. And we'll be back tomorrow. In the meantime, we're going to hand back to Al Jazeera's global headquarters in Doha for continuing coverage of the war with Iran. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
All right, guys, thank you all for joining the stream tonight. We're going to knock out like one more half hour, maybe an hour if things go well. Please remember to like and subscribe. It helps the channel. I love you all very much. I'll be right back.
Hello, I'm Imran Khan. This is the News Hour live from Doha, coming up in the next 60 minutes.
President Trump does not bluff, and he is prepared to unleash hell.
A new stark warning from the US demanding Iran accept defeat or face more brutal attacks. Iran's foreign minister says Tehran does not intend to negotiate with the US, but will continue to resist and defend the country. And the US and Israel carry out airstrikes across Iran. At least 12 people are killed in southern Tehran. Plus,
From destruction to diplomacy. On This Is America, we look at what's behind the White House pivot and what message Donald Trump's wartime strategy sends to the American people.
now, while behind the scenes diplomatic efforts appear to be underway to end the Iran conflict in public, there's been a sharp escalation of rhetoric. The US has urged Iran to accept defeat. White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt has warned of dire consequences if it doesn't.
If Iran fails to accept the reality of the current moment, if they fail to understand that they have been defeated militarily and will continue to be, President Trump will ensure they are hit harder than
Continue
they have
to be
ever been
what?
hit before.
Defeated militarily?
President Trump
I thought they
does
were
not
already
bluff,
defeated
and he is
militarily.
prepared to
They're
unleash
completely
hell.
obliterated.
Iran should not
Unleash
miscalculate
hell.
again.
Give me a break. Is this the type of
Iran,
rhetoric we
however,
want to
says
hear
it's the US
from our
that faces
leaders
defeat.
in
Foreign
Washington?
Minister Abbas Araghchi
This
says
stupid
no
bitch should be fired.
negotiations are underway, despite
Trump should be
assertions
fired.
From President Donald Trump, Araghchi says those claims prove that the US is losing the fight.
The fact that the talk of negotiations
Well,
now
we're not
being
winning.
raised is, in itself, a clear admission of defeat. Weren't they previously speaking about unconditional surrender? What has happened now
Yes, they
that they're
were.
talking about negotiations and requesting them? I will explain that there is no negotiation taking place, but the very fact that they are mobilizing their highest-ranking officials to negotiate with the Islamic Republic indicates that they have accepted defeat.
All Iran has to do is not lose. That's it.
Iran and Israel. Western
Stay in
Iran,
power.
the capital of Tehran, has
And they've
come
won.
under daily attack. Iran has retaliated by launching missiles at central and northern Israel. We have correspondents covering the latest developments from Amman, Tehran, and Washington, D.C., where we start with Teresa Bow. Teresa, very, very strong words there from Caroline Leavitt unleashing hell. How's that going down in Washington, D.C., particularly with the Democrats who want an end to this war?
Well, many here are calling it coercive diplomacy, negotiating from a position of strength, keeping the door of war open. That's what it seems after the comments of the White House press secretary, Karen Leavitt, where she spoke about unleashing hell if Iran does not accept the United States agreement. Earlier, Donald Trump had already warned that if Iran does not accept the United States,
Thanks for stopping by, Mac Daddy.
it's going to be hit
Don't forget to like and subscribe.
than it had ever been hit before. So certainly there's been lots of strong words coming from the White House. And this is what we have been seeing, the United States saying that it's winning the war, that it's in control of Iran, among other things. And this is happening as this 15-point plan is being discussed, is being reported. Karen Leavitt was asked about this plan. She did not deny it exists. She said that she could, some elements
It only
of
exists in
were
Trump's
true.
mind.
She also did not
Iran doesn't give a
confirm
shit
what is
about
being
it.
discussed right now. That is a possibility that the Vice President, J.D. Vance, could be heading to Islamabad to participate in high-level talks with Iran. Again, the White House press secretary did not confirm this. But all of this is happening, and all these talks of negotiations are happening as the United States continues to build up the military in the Middle East. Over the weekend, we already reported that 2,500 Marines were being deployed, 3 more extra warships. We're now hearing that the 82nd Airborne Division, this is an elite force of parachuters, of paratroopers that are involved in special operations that had the capacity of being deployed anywhere in the world in just 24 hours, are also being deployed to the Middle East. So certainly there's lots of talks about what these units are going to be doing, and the speculation is that they could be involved in an operation in Harg Island, which has been referred as Donald Trump as the
That'd be a
jewel
big
of
mistake.
the crown, mostly because around 90% of Iran's
Trump's going to get more American kids killed for nothing.
This build-up, this military
For
build-up that is
nothing.
ongoing, certainly shows that the United States is trying to negotiate while at the same time increasing the pressure on Iran. But aside from all these strong words, aside from, what we're seeing, this talks of winning the war, of this victory message, everyone here knows that the situation in Iran is extremely difficult, that Iran continues to control the Strait of Hormuz, that the Strait of Hormuz has a direct influence on the price of oil, and the Iranians know, and the United States knows also, that the price of oil can be decisive in the midterm elections that are going to be happening later on this year. And of course, will have a direct impact on the Trump administration.
That's Teresa Boat with the view from Washington. Let's get the view now from Tehran. Now, earlier, Iran's state TV outlined 5 specific conditions in which Iran would agree to end the war. Now, these include a complete halt to aggression and assassinations by the enemy, the establishment of concrete mechanisms to ensure the war is not reimposed on the Islamic Republic.
I agree with you, Mac Daddy. Tell Trump that.
Payment of war
He's the one
damages
bringing
and
the darkness.
reparations, the conclusion of the war across all fronts, and for all resistance groups to be involved throughout the region. And
he tends to bring the
international
worst out of
recognition
people.
And guarantees regarding
Not the
Iran's
best.
sovereignty to sovereign right to exercise authority over the Strait of Hormuz. Let's go straight to Mohammed Val, who's in Tehran for us. Now, Arakshi has been very clear. No talks, and that's despite Iranian state TV outlining what talks might look like.
Well, that's right. The Iranian leaders, including the foreign minister, are saying that until now they are not at the stage of talks. What is happening is an exchange of messages through intermediaries. And this is not called negotiations or talks, and it doesn't necessarily mean that there will be that stage anyway. The Iranians are saying that they're not eager for negotiations because they don't trust the other side. And whatever offers or suggestions come from the other side, they consider them just bluffs. Until now, they don't see that level of engagement and that level of seriousness on the other side because they have seen the experience of June, the war of June, 12 days, and also the war in February. And until now, they particularly with regards to those 15 points, for them, this is a proof that the Americans are not serious, because there is no way Iran will accept those 15 points. Iran has its own also demands that you have just enumerated, and they're not also ready to compromise on those 5 demands. So until now, we are just at the stage of pre-talks.
There's absolutely no reason for Iran to
intermediaries,
accept Trump's
and
conditions.
The Iranians are saying that
None.
they are studying whatever suggestions come to them. And you know, the situation is difficult also in Iran for negotiators because of the chasing of the leaders, the assassination of the leaders, and the Pakistanis are saying that it is difficult even for them sometimes, or most of the time, to reach the right people in Iran. So it takes time, and it is a very difficult process. But as I said, the foreign minister is very clear that Iran is not budging and is not intending to compromise on those 5 demands if and when it comes to the negotiation table. So it's going to take time, and at the time being, it's just war. They are relying on their military might, and they think that it is the only guarantor of Iran's sovereignty, and that's why you have seen, and we are seeing wave after wave of strikes against Israel and other targets across the region.
That's Mohammed Val live for us there from Tehran. Now, let's take a look at all of the latest US troop deployments. The amphibious assault ship, a USS Tripoli, is leaving Taiwan and is scheduled to arrive in the Middle East later this week. The US vessel is carrying the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit with its complement of F-35 stealth jets and about 2,300 Marines. Another assault ship, the USS Boxer, left Southern California last week, along with accompanying warships. It's expected to arrive in the region by mid-April, with around 2,200 Marines from the 11th Expeditionary Unit.
Hey,
And 2,000
what's going on, man?
from the 82nd Airborne Division are expected to deploy.
You're arriving a little late.
I'm
only doing like another 20 minutes.
Now,
maybe
joining me in the studio
maybe get
is,
to 7
Ross
o'clock.
Larson. He's
Maybe.
a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and author of Decoding Iran's Foreign Policy. Just going through the figures there, the actual US deployments, I'm almost reminded of 2003 and the invasion occupation of Iraq. Are we in a danger here that we're kind of, the Americans are almost sleepwalking because they're forgetting their own history into another quagmire that was Iraq in 2003?
Well, it's a very interesting analogy, Imran. I think in 2003, there at least was a narrative. It may have been a false narrative about weapons of mass destruction and so forth, and liberating the people from Saddam Hussein. Now we don't really have a narrative. And I think it's important to say that the Israelis and the Iranians each have a narrative. They've had a history over the last number of years of vilifying each other. And so it's very clear what the Israelis are trying to do, and it's very clear what the Iranians are trying to do. It's not clear what the Americans are trying to do. So when we talk about parallels with 2003, we talk about the troops coming, it's unclear. I mean, it looks like this is an attempt to basically subdue or get Iran to submit in some way, but for what objective? It's not, you're not going to liberate, you're not going to change the regime with 2,000 or 3,000 or 4,000 troops. It would require, if at all, it would require hundreds of thousands of troops. It would require major military operation, similar to what we had, and maybe even much bigger than we had happened in Iraq. So yeah, I think the Americans typically lack a sense of history. The Iranians do have a sense of history. It goes back thousands of years. The Israelis have a history. It's a history that goes back to 48, but also goes back to the Second World War and so forth. So they have a history. And there's at least a sense of historical memory. We have none in the United States. It's a the clock tends to start when the shooting starts.
He is a clown. I agree.
And
I don't disagree with what you're saying, Mac Daddy.
Of pain,
but
rather than, and so it's not clear.
I've been an ever-Trumper since the 1980s. Been a piece of shit and a grifter and a slime ball and a liar.
Wreaking greater
his whole life
without a clear political objective, and certainly not a political objective that they can explain to the American people.
But even if there is a short-term memory loss here, people have forgotten what it was like in Iraq in 2003. There is an institutional memory that the military has. There's military colleges that study what went wrong in Vietnam, in Iraq. There are generals that are very experienced that fought in those wars. Those voices are they being lost deliberately?
It's hard to know, Imran, because this administration is very opaque. I can tell you that typically what you have is you have military voices that are explaining the risk, the modalities of risk, the various possible contingencies. They do war planning and so forth, but they leave it up to
You also have military leaders in the United States who think this is a holy war
the political objectives.
because they're
And
nuts.
typically that president is informed by a series of advisors. They would have somebody that understood Iran. They would have somebody that understood the nuclear file. They would have you would have a clear sort of institutional interaction.
Yeah, I agree, Billy.
Interagency interaction within the U.S. government. You don't really have that now. So as smart as the military folks are,
Trump doesn't know what he's doing.
It's not clear.
You put 2,500 boots on the ground.
And I'm not a
lot of them
military
are coming home
analyst,
in
so
caskets.
put that caveat out there. Could be what would it take to occupy Karg Island, and what would be the risk? But in terms of what the president is trying to actually accomplish
fuck Israel
at the end
too.
of the day, in terms of
Welcome,
advancing
Zado.
U.S. interests at a time when U.S. interests seem to be undermined in the region, that's not clear, and that's not the job of the military. That's why in the system, a system that works, we have a civilian leadership and a military leadership, and they are distinct. And right now, you may have a very capable, I'm sure we do, very capable military leadership, but you have your political leadership in terms of quality of leadership, quality of analysis, and quality of decision-making seems to have gone AWOL.
And that AWOL that you're talking about,
Well,
gives an
don't hire
opportunity
Fox
for a country
News
like
weekend
Israel, we're talking about this
correspondents
just
to run your
earlier,
Department
to
of
take
Defense
advantage and push for their own goals.
and your
Now, you've already
Justice
said,
Department.
that Israel has a very clear objective here.
Fuck.
So, is there an opportunity for Israel here to get the United States to capitulate anything that they do in Lebanon and the occupied West Bank?
You always
and
got to be on the
Gaza,
lookout for a false
and
flag,
just
Billy.
in return for them quietening down on any potential deal that the Americans might get on Iran?
If you asked me a question like that 10 years ago with another president, I would have said it's all fiction, right? Because I cannot imagine an American president allowing. We've given Israel a long leash, but in terms of allowing them to wreak havoc on Lebanon, a country that we have some interest in, that could affect Syria, and wreak havoc on the Palestinians in Gaza, and possibly even annex the West Bank, I would tell you that you'd be crazy at that point in time, 10 years ago. Today, that's quite possible. Now, what that does in terms, I think for that to happen, the war would have to wind down but not end, because I don't think it's possible to completely have an agreement with Iran that would then allow the Israelis go in and somehow clean out, basically destroy Lebanon. So, but there are situations where conflicts end. I mean, conflicts typically will end in either in one party being defeated or the other, or some kind of an actual agreement. It does not appear right now that either of those scenarios, where we sit today and where we sit today in Doha, that those things are in the offing. But sometimes wars in the Middle East tend to just sort of atrophy over time. They tend to attenuate. In
What
that
do you mean,
scenario,
David?
What you're talking about is a possibility. I hate to say that it's a possibility, but it is a possibility. How realistic it is something we're going to find out, Imran, together in the next couple of days, aren't we?
So if we will talk about this again, but we are unfortunately running out of time, Ross, and it's always fascinating talking with you. So we'll come back to you in the next couple of days, as you say. Now, Iran's keeping up its retaliatory strikes inside Israel. An Iranian missile landed near the northern city of Haifa, sending a plume of smoke into the air. Another attack caused a large fire at a warehouse in the town of Yashrish. And Israel's continued its strikes on Beirut, with attacks also reported in several towns.
Thanks, Mac
across
Daddy.
Lebanon.
Appreciate it, brother.
Israeli Prime Minister
Thank you.
Benjamin Netanyahu says the military is expanding what it calls a buffer zone inside Lebanese territory. Now, more than 1,000 people have been killed across Lebanon since Israel started its latest attacks 3 weeks ago.
We have created a genuine security zone that does not allow a ground infiltration towards the Galilee or the northern border. We are expanding the security zone to push the threat from anti-tank missiles on our communities and on our territory. We are simply creating a large buffer zone.
Now, Rob McBride is following developments in Israel from the Jordanian capital, Oman. We've heard there from Netanyahu, but what's the wider view in Israel about possible negotiations?
Yeah, I think publicly all Israeli officials, up to and including Prime Minister Netanyahu, are keen to show absolute unity with their US allies, trusting that as good friends they will bear in mind the vital interests of Israel.
You need our money and our weapons.
Of course, there
so
are real concerns about just where any
you should toe the line a little
might
bit.
lead and whether they're going to cross any of Israel's red lines. For example, on what kind of regime might be left in Tehran. Some opinion writers in Israel are writing they don't want to be just seeing different faces on the same regime. So while I think broadly there is a skepticism about, given the difference between the two positions, whether any negotiations might actually lead anywhere, there is concern that they need to be preparing for the contingency of, for example, a sudden ceasefire being called, given the whiplash nature of the diplomacy coming out of the White House. Some Israeli officials quoted in US media have been saying that because of that, the actual military campaign has been accelerated, that some of the targeting, especially in the next few days, has been concentrated just in case a sudden ceasefire is called. And there is a concern about the longer-term campaign now underway in Lebanon against Hezbollah, whether that might be thwarted by any negotiations. That was the basis of this discussion we just heard there from Netanyahu talking with mayors and community leaders from northern border communities bordering with Lebanon. And just with regard to that possible upcoming campaign, on Wednesday, the government gave approval for the raising of the military ceiling for the call-up of reservists to 400,000 from the current level of 280,000, giving an idea of the possible scope of what's to come.
Rob McBride there, live for us from Amman. Now, Iraq has summoned the top US diplomat in Baghdad to protest a deadly strike on a military clinic in Anbar province, west of the capital. State media say at least 20 Iraqi soldiers were killed or wounded in the attack. The government has called it the strike a serious violation of international law, and it says it reserves the right to respond and will file a complaint with the United Nations. And staying with Iraq, it has some of the world's largest oil reserves, but the money it earns doesn't fully flow through Baghdad. Instead, a system set up after the US invasion in 2003 still gives Washington lasting
I love this scam we got going on here.
Jeez. Reports.
One of the richest oil fields in the world is in southern Iraq. It's called Majnoon, which means crazy in Arabic. But what's equally crazy is that the revenue from this oil field and others like it is controlled by the United States. America doesn't own them. It doesn't pump the crude, but more than 2 decades after its invasion, it retains influence over Iraq's most important source of income. This has real-world consequences for Iraqi politics and the economy, and on how Baghdad balances domestic interests with US expectations. After the 2003 invasion of Iraq, the US imposed a new financial structure on energy revenue, mandating that proceeds from oil and gas sales be paid into the Development Fund for Iraq, or DFI. The fund was based at the New York Federal Reserve Bank, so Iraqi oil revenue remained outside Iraq. The DFI eventually became an account of the Central Bank of Iraq. Legally, this money belongs to Iraq, but operationally it continues to pass through American financial and regulatory systems, meaning the US controls the financial plumbing through which Iraqi oil revenues flow. On paper, this doesn't violate Iraqi sovereignty, but in practice, it gives the US a semi-permanent hold on Iraq's economy. From the start, the spending of these funds was plagued by poor oversight. Between 2004 and 2007, the US Department of Defense did not properly account for $2.6 billion of the $9.1 billion, nearly a third of Iraq's oil revenue for that period. That's according to the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction. It also found that the remaining more than $6 billion was poorly managed. Not just administrative negligence, it set a precedent that Iraq's own revenues could be administered outside Iraqi institutions. To date, revenue remains in dollar accounts at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, creating a structural dependency. It goes further. Iraqi government reports suggest US officials have warned Baghdad Washington could restrict Iraq's access to oil revenues if Iran-aligned political actors make the Iraqi government. Blocking or delaying access to dollar-dominated oil revenue could cripple the economy. Iraq cannot bypass the US dollar system. Its financial system is dollarized, meaning the local currency's value is pegged, and its central bank and government must comply with U.S. anti-money laundering.
We could
and
just shut off the
sanctions
flow
norms
of that money back
access
to
their
Iraq
own
just
money.
like that.
Analysts say Washington
Just keep
could use
it.
this as a bargaining chip in negotiations, particularly when
A
it comes to
bargaining
Iraq's
chip, or if we
relationship
just
with
need it
Iran
because of
and
some sort
domestic
of
militia groups.
economic
This
collapse,
is not
we need the
theoretical.
dollars.
It is leverage
They're there,
rooted in Washington's
coming in
regulatory
forever.
authority over the global financial system. There's an important distinction here, as the U.S. does not own Iraqi oil fields. U.S. companies do not control production or export volumes, and Iraq remains responsible for signing oil contracts and setting output through its national institutions. The leverage is financial and regulatory, not military occupation or seizure of assets, and it gives the U.S. a chokehold over Iraq's core national revenue stream. It's also a tool of geopolitical pressure, which can be used to influence how Baghdad balances relations with Tehran, Moscow, and domestic political coalitions. In Russia, the US is trying to control the oil, making it harder to sell and less profitable. In Venezuela, the US effectively holds the oil. And in Iraq, the US holds the money from the oil.
Now, the war between the US, Israel, and Iran is triggering an energy and economic crisis around the world. Asia's the hardest hit, with many countries heavily dependent on oil and gas from the Middle East. Kulsum Sharif explains.
The war in the Middle East has sent shockwaves right across Asia, from India to Indonesia. Now, the conflict poses a major challenge for the continent as the world's biggest consumer of Middle East crude oil. And it's all because of what's happening here in the world's most important energy corridor, the Strait of Hormuz. Roughly about 20% of global oil and gas supplies produced in the region pass through this strait. Now, Iran has effectively shut it since the start of the war, blocking shipments, most of which are meant for Asia. Also, the attacks on energy sites across the region hasn't helped because it's resulted in a halt in production. Now, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh rely heavily on the Gulf for their energy needs. Now,
Democrats have tried to push to get to subpoena Trump Jr., Don Jr., and Republicans have blocked it. They won't let him testify
Now, the oil and gas reserves in
about the
Pakistan
president's
and
family
Bangladesh
businesses.
are low, and this is the impact. People scrambling to get fuel, and several shops already shut. Now, China is faring better because it's already stockpiled crude before the war began. It's one of the biggest buyers of Iranian oil despite Western sanctions. And Iran has reportedly allowed Chinese vessels to pass through the Strait of Hormuz on the other side to bring in supplies. And Beijing also has another reliable partner, and that's Russia, for its supplies over pipelines over land. Now we have Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan that have introduced energy voucher programs to protect consumers from rising prices. And for the first time in decades, Seoul has introduced a fuel cap, and Japan is relying on its national reserves to tide over the crisis. Then we have Thailand and Indonesia that have also introduced some measures. Thailand has put a cap on diesel prices for now, and Indonesia says it's offering fuel subsidies. Finally, we have Vietnam and the Philippines that are struggling. Vietnam doesn't have much of oil reserves. It lasts about 20 days. And we have the Philippine president who's declared an energy emergency that allows authorities to prioritize fuel distribution.
China is one of the world's largest energy importers, and the rising cost of fuel is affecting businesses and households. But while many are struggling, some sectors are benefiting from the shift in energy markets. Katrina Yu has more from the capital.
For hundreds of motorists across China, the impact of the war in Iran has become impossible to ignore. This week, petrol and diesel prices saw their sharpest increase in decades. Wang Sheng drives approximately 300 kilometers per day and fills up his tank 3 times a week. He now pays 18% more to top up than he did before the war.
Petrol cars are becoming unaffordable now, especially for professional drivers like me.
Beijing has adjusted prices twice since the conflict began. It reviews price caps every 10 days. The fuel
Lots of
price hikes would
EVs
have
in
been
China,
even
cheap
steeper
ones.
if not for the Chinese government stepping in to reduce the price increase by almost half. But motorists worry that support
Trump has
may
created
not
all this
last.
chaos all by
China
himself.
is one of the world's largest crude oil importers. Before the war, about 40% of its supply passed through the Strait of Hormuz. Beijing has ordered refineries to limit exports of gasoline and diesel and other products such
I
as
hear you, Billy.
fertilizer. So far, it's holding back from tapping into its vast strategic reserves, estimated at more than 900 million barrels. But there are some short-term winners. Rising fuel prices have accelerated interest in electric vehicles. Shares in major
BYD,
EV and
baby.
battery companies have surged since the war began, with investors betting higher oil prices will push more consumers towards battery power. Still, those benefits may not last. Chinese officials warn a prolonged conflict will leave no industry or country unscathed. They're calling on Iran, the US, and Israel to abandon force and return to talks.
The Strait of Hormuz is vital to global energy security and supply chain stability. Its continued closure will bring unbearable consequences to all.
Back on the road, Wang Sheng says he's so far absorbing the extra petrol costs, but says if the war doesn't end soon, he'll be forced to go electric. Katrina Yu, Al Jazeera, Beijing.
Financial markets remain volatile as investors weigh the prospects of an end to the war. Major US indices rose early on Wednesday after President Trump suggested diplomatic efforts with Iran were making progress. They've since pared back some of the gains. The global oil benchmark price dropped below $100 a barrel before climbing back up. You're watching Al Jazeera, a reminder of our latest developments in the conflict that's engulfed much of the Middle East. The White House has warned that President Donald Trump is prepared to unleash hell on Iran if it doesn't accept its terms for a ceasefire. Spokesperson Caroline Leavitt said although efforts through diplomatic back channels haven't hit a dead end. Iran's foreign minister has denied that any talks are underway with the US. Abbas Araghchi says the US is attempting to negotiate with Iran is proof that it's accepted defeat. And the US.
All right, guys, thanks a lot for coming tonight. I got to get out of here. I'll be back Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we'll do a nice 3-4 hour one. All right? Love you all.